Magic and Mystery by Allegory for Hatred. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. 31 Magic. Dazai didn't think Mori was going to believe any of those, though. There wasn't any believable or kind way to write, "I don't want to deal with you." So Dazai didn't write anything at all. Instead, he wandered the halls of Hogwarts. Professor Quirrell would be seeing him soon, but until then Dazai was too wound up to lay around and wait. Thinking about Mori wouldn't do him any good. He was certain that the annoying doctor wouldn't have any information for him, so there wasn't much point in asking. The most he could do might be to ask for drugs, something to help him with his headaches and the more recent dizzy spells. Dazai didn't get sick, of course. He existed in a general state of perfect health, much to his annoyance, but he wasn't deluded enough to pretend he wasn't feeling different. It was a whole week after killing the troll before Dazai had started to feel better, and he had thought that was that. No longer human had calmed down, his energy had been restored, and he'd even started eating a little, but it was getting worse again somehow. During his lesson with Quirrell on Wednesday, Dazai had 3 dizzy spells before the professor finally let him go for the evening. Just thinking about it quirked Dazai's lips into a smile. It was, curiously, only when he tried to cast a spell that his stomach would fold in on itself. Dazai still wasn't sure what that meant. Was he just becoming more sensitive to nullifying magic? For today, it just meant he was annoyed. Whatever this was better fix itself out before he had to see Madame Pomfrey next week, because Dazai was only about 50% sure she would believe it if he just smiled wordlessly through their meeting. Doctors were too perceptive for their own good. Damn. He was back on Mori again. Maybe if he could finally convince Ron to take his owl, then Dazai wouldn't have to ever send a letter back. Mori would have to accept that, one way or another. With a resigned sigh, Dazai hunched over slightly and skirted around a corner. With his luck, he'd just have a new owl by the end of the month anyway. He felt fine now, but after his remedial lesson with Quirrell tonight, Mr. Dazai, he'd be sick for sure. Dazai blinked out of his thoughts just in time to not run face first into Professor Snape's chest. "Professor," he said dumbly. He'd been so caught up in his musings that Snape had seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. How embarrassing. "Good evening." Snape's eyes narrowed, and he did not return the kind greeting. However, the professor did run his gaze over Dazai's bandaged frame critically, cautiously. And, oh, right, Madame Pomfrey had told Snape about his habits. Suddenly, standing under those cold black eyes made the sick little feeling in Dazai's stomach curl. When Professor Snape spoke, his voice lacked some of the harshness it usually held. That there was any vitriol at all was something of a relief. "Feeling better, are we?" Dazai's lips curled up pleasantly in response, even if it was stretched too thin at the edges. "Insufferable as always, I see." Snape ground out, "I expect it's useless to attempt to persuade you to do your assignments. Though judging by your performance in my class, perhaps it's for the best I never see your work." "Kind as ever, sir." Dazai mimicked cleanly. He snorted, then bounced back on his heels. "Was there something you needed, Professor?" Being watched like this. It was just as bad as when Pomfrey stared down his arms and said useless things about malnutrition. Just as bad as when the twins rushed him off to the infirmary. He couldn't decide how to feel about it, really. The professor merely grit his teeth. After a moment, he seemed to decide on what to say. When he did, it was with a careful voice. "All of your classes are done for the day. Go back to your dorm. Surely one of your friends is there." "I wouldn't call them my friends," Dazai answered back reflexively. "So long as they aren't bullying you, I suspect you should count your blessings, boy." Ah, that was very accurate. Still, a bit disconcerting that Snape was aware of Dazai's precarious position in Hogwarts and hadn't tried to step in yet. Although he supposed the fact that Slytherin was mostly full of pure-blood supremacists was just as well known as Dazai's being Muggleborn was. There wasn't much to be done, except to play politics after all. Dazai smiled. Maybe. At the very least he trusted Blaise. "But I'm not just wandering around. And Fred and George aren't with me, so you know I'm not getting up to any trouble." Snape seemed to pause at that. "That is an unfortunate friendship." Dazai nodded, spurred on by the reaction. He was well aware of the numerous pranks Professor Snape had been victim to. He'd planned a few of them himself, even. "Besides, I still have a class tonight. I'm only a little turned around." No surprise there. Gallivanting around campus with Mr. Malfoy, M&M's Parkinson, and Mr. Zabini does not constitute a class. Snape's gaze caught on his bandaged arms. Damn. Ah, you know about Tat? I'm not the idiot you take me for, Mr. Dazai. He half chuckled and shook his head. At the movement, Dazai's curly, chocolate bangs hung over into his eyes. They were starting to get too long. You're plenty smart, sir. Just a bit of a stick in the mud. Letting out a melodramatic sigh, Dazai willed himself to deflate a bit. I really am turned around, you know. Aren't you going to help me out? And stop watching me like that. Snape's eyes immediately snapped away from the bandages wrapping around Dazai's neck, as if he had heard the unspoken words there. The professor cleared his throat. I suppose I could walk you back to your dorm room. We should. Snape paused, and the words behind his throat seemed to fight him. Talk. I still have class, Dazai echoed, making his voice firm in a way that suggested, no, they would not be talking about what Pomfrey had said under any circumstances. I was going to show up late just to make Professor Quirrell sweat, but I don't want to be interrogated by you. In the end, I'm feeling generous. Snape snapped to attention. He stared silently at Dazai for a second before his whole posture became very serious. Dazai felt himself tense up in anticipation. You have an extra class with Professor Quirrell? Dazai blinked. Did you not know? Hadn't Quirrell said he'd spoken with the other professors about the remedial lessons? He has himself convinced that he can teach me magic where everyone else has failed. Maybe he'll let me off early tonight if I tell him I'm feeling sick. But Dazai's cheery musings didn't lighten the weight of Snape's stoic expression. Without warning, the potions master grabbed each of Dazai's shoulders with white-knuckled hands. Dazai tensed up horribly, his entire body going stock still at the unexpected pressure of being held in place. And Snape's eyes, Dazai had been right, Quirrell was definitely trouble. And the other professors knew about it, to the point of visible panic lighting Snape's usually dark eyes up. Snape seemed to notice immediately how Dazai had frozen beneath his touch, because he withdrew his grasp and took a step back a second later. The mafioso was sure that his face was bleached white as well. Snape let out a tight breath. How long, his voice was low, exactly have you been meeting with him? Only a week, Dazai answered, his breath carefully still. He could still feel the impression of Professor Snape's hands on his shoulders. Sir. There was something odd in Snape's expression that Dazai couldn't quite place. These remedial lessons. What has he been teaching you? Dazai narrowed his eyes and tried to control his breathing. There was no time to fuss over these silly little reactions of his, the panic at being touched unexpectedly, the fear of talking about his cuts and eating habits. He needed to focus on the now, on what Professor Snape knew about Quirrell, and subsequently, the mountain troll from Halloween. He needed to focus on that, because if he didn't, Dazai would start nervously scratching at his arms again. And that had turned out so great last time. Magic, mostly. I haven't managed any spells yet, though, Dazai replied evenly. Watching Snape carefully, Dazai could see the way the professor was trying to hide the way he bit his lip. Dazai tried to recall how Professor Snape had reacted when they'd run into Quirrell at the leaky cauldron, but couldn't differentiate one expression from the other. Casually, he inquired, "What's the matter, sir?" The muted question seemed to startle Snape from his thoughts, and he didn't appear to realize the innocent manipulation in Dazai's question. He was just a hurt kid to Snape, after all. Pomfrey had made sure of that. Still, when the potion master sighed, he wasn't relenting so much as walling himself off. Whatever secrets Professor Quirrell had hidden away, Dazai had sniffed them out, sure, but it was clearly a much bigger ordeal than he had thought. Remedial lessons, Snape said after a moment. Be careful not to strain yourself, boy. All of the panic in Snape's voice had completely melted away. Instead, it was now masked behind that careless expression once again. Whatever Snape was thinking, he wasn't going to tell Dazai about it. I'm working on it, Dazai replied, semi-honestly. Snape nodded, not at all looking reassured. He spared away glance around the halls, but they were empty except for a few on-looking paintings. I need to speak with the headmaster immediately, but I suppose I could walk you to your lesson. He nodded, stern, then immediately set off in the direction Dazai had originally come from without so much as a glance to see if his student was following. Dazai had to half-run the first few steps to catch up. He spared a sideways glance to Snape as they walked. Tense. That's probably how he'd describe a look like that. It should fill Dazai with dread. but it just made him a bit eager instead. He always loved a good mystery. As they walked, neither student nor professor spoke. Dazai didn't want to be the first to break the silence, even though he desperately wanted to, as what had the Hogwarts staff so wary of Professor Quirrell. After all, they shouldn't have the natural instincts of a mafia dog to sniff out fellow monsters. Had they pieced it together from the troll alone? That didn't seem right. He'd already jarred Professor Snape too much to push now, and Dazai was pleased enough with not having to talk about his trip to the infirmary that he didn't feel the need to press further. Smiling aimlessly, Dazai ignored the watchful gazes of other students on him as Snape escorted him to the defense against the dark arts classroom. Once they arrived, however, Professor Snape seemed to hesitate. Before Dazai could reach out to open the door, Snape asked, "Behave yourself, Mr. Dazai." "Always, sir." Dazai laughed. It was a lie, of course, but Professor Snape didn't look annoyed in the slightest. He was still wearing that tense look, like he wanted to trap Dazai beneath his hands once again, like he didn't want Dazai to enter Quirrell's classroom. Smiling, Dazai tried not to look too pleased with closing the door on Snape's face. He whirled on his feet with a large, pasted-on grin. It wouldn't do to give off the impression that he just had the strangest conversation with Snape about his remedial lessons. Not yet, at least. Quirrell was blinking owlishly at him from behind his desk, as if his sudden entrance had startled him out of something important. Dazai watched his professor frantically tuck in the edges of his turban. "Professor Quirrell, I'm here for my lesson." He stumbled. "I see that, Mr. Dazai. You're certainly eager. Was that Severus Snape with you?" Dazai hummed, rolling back on his heels. "He was nice enough to show me the way after I got lost." Then, smiling vaguely, he added, "Though I think he just wanted the excuse to yell at me about potions." "All right," Quirrell said haltingly. There was something there for sure. He shot a sideways glance at the front door. When Snape didn't enter behind Dazai, Professor Quirrell smiled in the sort of untrustworthy way he always did. Dazai smiled too, and it was of the same ilk. "Have you been practicing the Verdimillious charm since Wednesday?" "Nope." Even if Dazai had seen any merit in doing something like that, it would have just made him sick to try. When Professor Quirrell started to speak again, Dazai pulled his wand from his book bag. What you need is perhaps a bit of motivation. Try for me now?" Dazai nodded. His wand was as pristine and useless as ever, but now when he raised it into the air, it also gave him a stomachache. Holding back a grimace, Dazai decided that after suffering through another lesson, he'd have no choice but to write to Mori asking for medicine. He would never get anything done if he was always on the verge of throwing up. But even before the charm left his mouth, a wave of vertigo rocked through Dazai's body. It felt like his insides were rearranging themselves, moving around, changing shape. Verdimillious. A tiny, green light flickered to life at the end of Dazai's wand. Then he threw up. 32 conflict of interest. This is the second time in the last 7 days that you've been in the infirmary. Draco's incessant barking was somewhere between annoyed and concerned. Dazai simply nodded along mindlessly. It probably would be rude to correct Draco with, "It's actually 3 times, right?" "What can I say?" he intoned, returning a quill back to his book bag. Dazai looked away from his most recent letter to Mori. He'd have to send that later today. "I'm a busy guy." "That's not." Draco droned on and Dazai zoned him out. Instead of listening, he quickly skimmed over his letter once more. "Winter break is coming up and I'd like to stay here. I promise I won't try to kill myself this time. I cast a spell yesterday. I'd like to keep practicing spells while I'm on campus. Apparently, spell casting off campus is forbidden, but I need to know the extent of this development. I'll instruct the owl not to hide dead things in your office if you give me a straight reply for once. Dazai." It was good. Well, as good as it was going to get. He'd never been able to lie to Mori. In the end, there wasn't a point to trying to hide the truth from that man, so he would just outright say it. The nullifier had cast a spell. One thing that still stuck out to him was Mori's confidence that Dazai would find a place at Hogwarts. Had the man known he would figure out how to use magic, despite no longer human? How? Dazai was still reeling from what had happened. The dizziness, the nausea, even his passing out a week ago, was it all connected to the fact that he successfully cast Verdimillious? He needed more information, needed those books on special abilities that didn't seem to exist here. He needed to stay on campus and test the limits of this revelation. Oi, are you listening to me? Dazai shook himself out of his thoughts, folding up the letter and slipping it into his bag before glancing up tiredly to see Draco's pinched face. Define listening. Both Draco and Dazai turned away from each other just in time to see Blaze crossing through the common room's threshold. He tilted his chin up at the passive smile Dazai was wearing by way of answer, then glanced to Draco instead. What did he do this time? Apparently, Draco grumbled, leaning back into his seat with a thump. This idiot overworked himself again. I threw up on Professor Quirrell. Dazai clarified cheerfully. You what? Well, he flapped a hand around lazily, near him. But there really isn't that much difference, is there? Anyway, Madame Pomfrey said I was using more magic than I could handle, and that I should take a break. It's been almost 3 months of daily practice. Blaze countered casually. He ran an assessing gaze up and down Dazai's figure before nodding. And you haven't cast a single successful spell. It is a bit surprising. What spell was it? Verdimillious, Dazai said with a sideways glance to Draco. But I need my dear, dear boss to help me with all the other spells, since he's much better than Quirrell. Or something. Draco clicked his tongue. Don't or something me. But Professor Quirrell isn't a pure blood like you, right? So clearly you're the better teacher. Leaning back in his chair, Dazai let his head flop to the side. Blaze looked down at him with an accommodating quirk of his brow. See? I do listen. Sometimes. But Dazai could see the hidden twitch of Draco's lips into a smile. It was as easy as ever, manipulating Draco. Not that he couldn't just run off and practice spells by himself, but there was something almost pleasant about bringing the club with him. He'd never say that aloud, of course. The look Blaze was giving him, though. Dazai wasn't sure the other snake wasn't reading the thoughts right out of his head. All right, fine, Draco said, with a sigh that wasn't at all as peeved-sounding as he'd probably intended. We can practice spells today. I already have my homework done anyway. He looked away, amused. And I know a lost cause when I see one, so I won't ask if you've finished any of your assignments. Blaze? He shrugged. I'll come with. My homework can wait. Ah, is Blaze taking after me now? You should keep up with your studies if you want to succeed in life, Dazai chastised in a voice, not at all dissimilar to Hermione's. I'm bringing snacks. The mafioso's mouth immediately snapped shut. And you're going to eat something on the way to the training grounds, otherwise you won't be practicing. He paused. After a second of blank staring, Draco sighed, looking deeply resigned. Just don't puke on me. Dazai nodded, emphatic. Glancing sideways to Dazai before replying, Blaze hummed. Whatever. He didn't put up any fuss except to amble out of the Slytherin common rooms. Blaze was certainly the type to just do whatever he wanted, and Dazai was sure the boy would have gone to get snacks even if Draco had turned him down. In the end, he wondered if Draco didn't know that Blaze wasn't loyal to him in the slightest. Blaze was loyal to himself, and that was that. Well, maybe he was loyal to Dazai too. He tried not to feel too pleased with that. Are you coming? Draco snapped, pulling Dazai's from his musings. The platinum-haired snake was glaring at him amicably from a few feet away. Ah, actually, boss. He'll be a while, won't he? Draco blinked, then squinted down at Dazai. I guess. Why? He laughed lightly. Don't sound so suspicious. Dazai pulled the bag up and around his head, then patted it twice. I was just wondering if I had time to walk Maury's letter over to the owlery. Best not to stall any longer than he already had. I was supposed to send it yesterday. For a moment, Dazai was certain he would be shot down. After all, if he was the boss here. He'd tell Draco where to shove it, and then maybe break one of his fingers for speaking out of turn. Nothing like a little pain to put a subordinate in place. Well, that was Mafia boss rules. That sort of thing didn't really apply to Hogwarts, did it? Regardless, he was still caught off guard when self-centered, pompous Draco merely nodded along in agreement. You shouldn't put off your duties, he said, self-assured. A pure wizard like myself would never neglect to send a missive on time, especially if it were to my father. I was in the infirmary, but okay. Draco spoke over him. I suppose we have time. Since I'm feeling so generous today, I'll walk with you so you don't get lost. Taking the unexpectedly easy agreement in stride, Dazai merely grinned. He plodded up to the door, following Draco out with a fake-sounding string of gratitudes on his lips. Almost immediately, Draco took the lead. Dazai bounced after him like a baby duckling. He was eager to get to practicing spells, but he supposed Draco was right. Correspondence with Mori would always take precedence. How boring. They walked mostly in silence. Draco's condescension often inspired silence in others. Not that Dazai bothered with that sort of thing outside of the Mafia, but he held his tongue for now. Yesterday's revelation was still buzzing around noisily in his brain. Magic. Him. It just didn't make sense. He had never managed a spell before. No longer human was proof enough of that. So why could he cast Verdimillious at all? And why now? Dazai spared a sideways glance to Draco, but the other snake's shock had entirely faded. Draco didn't have the full picture. Sure, it was surprising that Slytherin's least favorite idiot had finally managed a spell, but Draco didn't know that even that much should be literally impossible. And it had been impossible. Up until yesterday, at least. Draco must have caught him looking, because when Dazai blinked out of his thoughts, the boy was watching him with a raised brow. Dazai glanced away passively, feeling put on the spot, even though Draco couldn't have possibly known what he had been thinking about. What? Draco's expression immediately morphed into quiet annoyance and he dismissed. Never mind. Too easy. Dazai shrugged mentally. Out of spite for something, he started walking just a step faster until Draco had to speed up as well in order to stay ahead. It wasn't long before they were at the owlery. Stepping past Draco, Dazai forced his way in before the other snake. As usual, the place was a mess. There were bones littering the floor and feathers strewn about the windows and caught in the air. It was chilly here now that the seasons had turned. With how the windows hung open at all hours of the day and night, the wind whistled noisily around the tower. Dazai shivered. Perhaps startled by their entrance, dozens of owl eyes shot to Dazai, then tracked his movement up the tower. He ignored them. Dazai scanned the birds watching him, looking for the one familiar owl among them. A shine of dark feathers caught his attention, and Dazai turned to his owl. Featherbrain wasn't alone. A familiar red head of hair was hovering over the bird and petting her feathers. When Dazai halted, the scuff of his shoe alerted Ron to his presence. Oh. Ron jumped slightly, clearly not having expected someone to interrupt him. In all fairness, Dazai hadn't expected to see Ron here either. This was unfortunate. Still, Dazai grinned. Finally come to take care of hair? Ron gestured to Featherbrain, who was picking at where his hand had stopped petting. The echo of steps following up the stairs indicated Draco wasn't all that far behind. What was there to do when your two friends hated each other? Should he convince Draco to leave now, before spotting the blood traitor? The utter bastard in Dazai kind of wanted to see what would happen if the two really had a chance to interact. The part of him that wanted to start a gang, however, wondered if keeping his subordinates from killing one another was a better move. Truly, a conundrum. Something like that, he said instead, smiling emptily. I have to deliver a letter. Featherbrain, get over here. The dark feathered owl fluttered over to him without hesitation, a fact that drew a peeved look to Ron's face. Dazai didn't waste time in pulling the letter from his bag and tying it to Featherbrain's talon. He was just sending it into flight with a feathery flap of 2 wings when Draco finally made his entrance. Dazai, what's taking so long? You didn't tell me that blood traitor was here. Ron bristled. At least my family isn't a bunch of Death Eaters. Dazai saw how those words had briefly paralyzed Draco. He was watching the exchange warily. It wasn't a second before Draco was barking back more insults. Well, aren't you full of yourself? He took a step closer to Ron, pushing past Dazai thoughtlessly. For someone who can't even cast Wingardium Leviosa properly, that is. Sneering, Ron's fingers twitched over the air behind him. Dazai's eyes narrowed. I can cast it better than you can, mate. Draco stuck his nose out. Typical Gryffindor, always thinking they're better than everyone else. Come on, Dazai. It's best not to stay in the presence of someone like that for too long. Dazai saw it before Draco did, but the blonde was still fast. Ron withdrew his wand with a glare in his eyes and a flash of his teeth. Before Ron's mouth had even opened to form a spell on his tongue, Draco's own wand was poised to attention. They were going to charm one another. This is what Hogwarts got for giving magically charged wands to 12-year-olds. The second they started bickering, sparks were flying. And really, all this infighting was no good. You couldn't have a gang that was always at odds with itself. Ron's wand was quick to point, and Draco's fast to return. but Dazai was faster. Wingardium Leviosa! The dizziness hit him first, then the sickness, and then the awareness that both Draco and Ron were held perfectly still about 2 inches off the ground. What? Draco's eyes shot around the room frantically, probably shocked that someone had managed to pull a spell off on him. It wasn't until he reached Ron that he could see the Weasley himself was also being held aloft. It only lasted for a second, though, before Dazai's spell lost its influence. He felt the magic slip through his fingers formlessly. It dripped off of his wand and pounded behind his eyes. The 2 dumbstruck wizards dropped to the ground with a snap of heel on cobblestone. Ron and Draco locked eyes for only a second before turning just in time to watch Dazai plummet to the floor too. They both rushed to his side without a moment of hesitation. Dazai tried to catch their expressions, but his vision was spotty and black around the edges. He wasn't aware of anything outside of the sickness roiling in his stomach, until a hand settled on his back. "Are you okay?" "I'm not working with some lousy Slytherin." Dazai trapped a keening whine in his throat when the room spun. They must have seen it on his face anyway. "Oi!" Draco's tongue clicked on the roof of his mouth like he was snapping gum. Both he and Ron were watching over the mafioso with matching tense expressions. Lips pressed together, brows pushed in. Looking between them, Dazai couldn't help but to smile sloppily. For 2 people who supposedly couldn't be more different, they both reacted the same way to him falling ill. Maybe he could make a decent gang out of them yet. Well, up until they were glaring at each other again. Dazai's fingers twitched over his wand where his fingers had clasped over it too tightly. He set it down on his lap, then sighed thoughtfully. Magic. It still didn't really register to Dazai. No longer human was banging around his skull, but it wasn't nullifying his spells. Not today, at least. When Dazai felt his sickness clearing a little, he looked up from his lap. Neither Ron nor Draco was throttling the other, so he counted it as a win, or whatever, Draco mocked. He poked Dazai's cheek. "Well, I didn't throw up on you. Consider that my thank you gift." Ron was watching them with wide eyes. "Shouldn't you go to the nurse?" "Thanks, boss." "You too," he thought, smiling. 33, just the 4 of us. When Dazai woke up, campus was mostly empty, and a brittle cold had settled into the air. He yawned and rubbed at his eyes through the blanket. The thick cloth hung around Dazai's frame. Sitting up, he let it cling to his body, unwilling to lose the heat built up under it. Blaze's bed was empty, sheets unwrinkled and exact. Most of the beds were empty. It was odd, he'd sort of gotten used to how crowded this place was. He could lie there forever tucked underneath warm blankets. In the end, it was the sound of other bedsheets shuffling that forced Dazai to his feet and out of the Slytherin common room. With winter break starting today, almost everyone had left campus, going home and visiting family. That just wasn't something Dazai wanted to have a hand in. Luckily, Mori had thought the same, although knowing the doctor, there was always some ulterior motive to his decisions. It couldn't just be that Dazai didn't want to go home. Mori was getting something out of this arrangement, and Dazai's relative freedom was dependent on that fact. Mori's letter rung in Dazai's head as he mutely shambled to the Great Hall in a sleepy haze. "Dazai," the letter read, "you never take initiative like this. I'm proud, that's so adorable. Consider it my gift to you, as far as your father will ever be aware. Hogwarts doesn't allow for students to return home over the winter break if they live overseas. You should really be more grateful to me, you know. After all I've done for you." He was the first one to arrive at the Great Hall. Sitting, his spine seemed to melt into the bench as he blinked rapidly to clear the sleep from his eyes. He'd been trying not to think about it, about what father must be thinking about all this. Avoiding the man through winter was practical for everyone involved. Dazai got to practice his magic. Mori didn't have to patch him up, but he wouldn't be able to avoid anything over the summer. No way to avoid the trainings, the yelling, the punishments, and Dazai would be in for one hell of a punishment too. After all, had father even wanted him to go to Hogwarts in the first place? Maybe he should be more grateful to Dr. Mori for that. Dazai sighed. "Looking a little worse for wear there, Snaky. Mind if we sit?" Shaken from his thoughts, Dazai blinked away from the table in time to see Fred and George sit one on each side of him. He smothered a yawn. "What's the point in asking if you're just going to sit anyway?" Fred hummed. "Well, you wouldn't say no to us." He snorted. "That was the plan. But retroactively, I've decided to maybe master one spell. For the past few weeks, Dazai had been spending more and more time split between Quirrell and the Loyalty Club. It was important, but it was also dreadfully exhausting. Draco had insisted that they pull back on training sessions, but that only drew Dazai to ask Quirrell for extra lessons. The circumstances of his using magic were too unusual to just ignore, and he'd be damned if he was going to let a little nausea keep him from exploring his new magical capabilities. At least he wasn't throwing up anymore. He was exhausted, though. If there was even a scrap of energy left in Dazai's bones, it was going straight into practicing spells. Even with all his practice, though, he could barely float things with Wingardium Leviosa. It wasn't for a lack of trying. Whenever he expressed wanted to practice more, Draco and Blaze would fret about him being sick again. But Quirrell would just smile. Dazai didn't trust the professor in the slightest, but he needed a guide to practice magic with, and Quirrell was willing. He would take what he could get. In the end, understanding why he could suddenly do magic was more important than figuring out whatever nonsense that troll had been about. Slumping into the table, Dazai ignored the twin hums going over his head. Well, a hand landed on his head, fluffing up his overgrown hair and tucking some stray locks behind his ears. "That's what winter break is for, resting up," George said. Fred continued. "Pulling pranks, practicing magic until I'm sick," Dazai added mentally. "Reading until I'm cross-eyed." He smiled, sitting up just enough to rest his chin on his fist. "Ron is staying over break too, isn't he?" Dazai deflected easily. "Will he be joining us in our latest prank endeavors? Think you can convince him? Our Ronnikins can be pretty stubborn." Fred and George perked up. "We were planning on throwing some snowballs at him, actually. Great minds and all that. Eh? That's all right, I guess." Dazai's dull voice died off abruptly as some of the staff began to arrive in the hall. Professor Snape gave him a brief nod before settling into his seat at the head of the room. Besides Snape, Professor McGonagall's eyes seemed to widen at the sight of two Gryffindors chatting amicably with a first-year Slytherin. Rolling his eyes, Dazai turned his attention back to the twins. "Actually," he continued, voice subdued now, "I have regular remedial lessons with Professor Quirrell, you know. Maybe I could dig up some dirt on him for you. Do something a bit more exciting than throwing snow at him." To be entirely honest, Dazai wasn't very familiar with the concept of snowballs as a recreational activity. Nor was he entirely sure what a snowball fight was, despite seeing a number of students apparently engaged in them on campus in the past few weeks. Dazai currently had it narrowed down to either an act of soft warfare or a tactic to rule out the weak links in a group. Regardless, Dazai had no desire to dirty his hands with something like that. He let some of that boredom slip onto his face. The twins looked amused at the prospect. Dazai felt his own eyes light with vague humor in response. He stole another tasteless blueberry from the table. "I'll keep you posted," Dazai smirked. "Speaking of Ron, in the meantime I have a great idea. Could you cast a spell for MME?" "Dazai," Ron squeaked, "why are my books flying?" "I have absolutely no idea," Dazai lied, smiling passively. "Why do you ask?" Expression frantic, Ron gestured wildly to where all of his textbooks were flying around the halls in circles over his head. Dazai smothered his smirk below a sloppy pout. The books were flapping their covers as if they were wings. Dazai had to admit, Fred and George were really great friends. They hopped on his idea to animate Ron's books the second he suggested it. Once he had a better grasp on magic, Dazai would have to ask the twins where they got all of their cool pranking magic from. "You hadn't noticed?" When Ron spun around to try and catch some of his charmed books, Dazai reached out lazily. The moment his finger brushed against its spine, the Transfiguration textbook collapsed. He caught it in the palm of his hand. "Nope," he popped the P. "Anyway, stop playing around." "Playing around?" Ron whirled on his feet once more. Dazai nearly broke out laughing when he saw the defense against the dark arts book struggling to take flight between Ron's shaking hands. The ginger blinked, eyes wide with something akin to shock once they had latched onto the textbook in Dazai's hand. "How did you do that?" You caught the book." During that brief moment of distraction, Ron's captive textbook writhed back out of his grasp. It stuttered away from the red head and joined its companions in circling overhead like a noisy paper vulture. His eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me," Dazai hummed, innocent. "You charmed them?" Ron balked. "Aren't you pranking me right now? That's irrelevant." "I'm not sure it is." Dazai waved him off. "It's not like you're doing anything else over winter break." He spared a brief glance to the last two books circling overhead. Well, nothing important. A stray book brushed over Ron's head, but the other boy let it go with a resigned sigh. Dazai beamed. He carefully plucked it from the air. Only one more to go. He definitely had to ask the twins what spell they used to do this. Just imagining what Draco's smug little face would look like when his cauldron would start to walk away. Priceless. Ron's expression was pretty amusing too. The ginger's lips were pressed firmly together. "Oi. Aw, come on. Hermione went home for break. She's not going to pester you about not studying." Dazai keened. "Don't be so stubborn, please. I'm trying to incite chaos." "I'm not stubborn," Ron grumbled stubbornly. Dazai's lips twitched. "Just, what do you have planned exactly?" "Not sure yet. Something fun, I guess." "Have any bright ideas?" He huffed out an exasperated sigh. Reaching out an open palm, Ron gestured towards his books. Dazai returned the de-animated books to their owner. Now that the charm was satisfactorily nullified, they easily acquiesced to Ron's tight grip. The mafioso blinked wide and slow in the closest approximation to puppy dog eyes Dazai thought he could manage. All right, I'll help with your prank." Ron pointedly turned away from Dazai's triumphant grin. "Just don't expect anything else for Christmas. Hey!" Between learning magic with Quirrell and planning an elaborate prank with the Weasleys, maybe this winter break wouldn't be so bad after all. Dazai found himself humming all the way to Quirrell's office despite himself. He couldn't wait to tell Blaze about whatever nonsense was going to unfurl next. 34 attachment. Dazai gave his wand a little twirl, and a small trail of green lights flickered to life at the end. Immediately, his insides twisted in protest. He cut the flow of magic off from the spell with a grimace. The Verdimillious charm dissipated in the air abruptly. Very good. "Eh, you think?" Dazai asked casually, turning to see Professor Quirrell's curious expression. He waved the wand around once more, only to feel his stomach clench up in anticipation. Damn. At this rate, I won't pass first year. Quirrell's smile twitched when Dazai kept the bored expression on his own face. Well, I'm sure something will work out. Jay, just a bit more practice now. A bit more practice. Dazai wasn't that optimistic. Still, he pasted on a thin smile. Dazai let his gaze wander around the room. Professor Quirrell was a tough nut. Where most of the other students were easy enough to prank, pranking a teacher had to be something special. Granted, he'd done his fair share of tormenting Professor Snape, but Dazai actually kind of tolerated Snape. Meanwhile, Quirrell was clearly someone with ulterior motives. Besides, he reasoned, it was winter break. Why not do something more exciting than casually destroying every cauldron Dazai ever touched? His gaze flitted across a stack of ungraded essays on the professor's desk. "How about trying more for me?" Professor Quirrell stuttered, tearing Dazai from his train of thought. Unless you think you might throw up. Again, no. Dazai shrugged. "Well, maybe." He smirked when Quirrell took a noticeable step back. "I'm just kidding. I haven't been sick from doing magic in a week." Dizzy spells be damned, Dazai was improving. Quirrell didn't look all that reassured. But then again, did the man ever look sure of anything? Absolutely not. Dazai found that to be a delightfully deceptive trait. What better way to look unassuming than to give off the impression that you were scared of everything? What better way to be underestimated than to look injured? Dazai almost tugged at his bandages, but stopped himself, just short. He smoothed out the aborted movement with another shrug of his wand and a mumbled, "Verdimillious." The subsequent wave of green lights that shot from his blackthorn wand was almost rewarding enough to shake the heavy weight of cloth bandages from Dazai's focus. The painful clenching of his stomach shook off the rest. Dazai held onto the spell until the nausea became almost too much to bear. Then he killed the spell, huffing with short breaths. "Good J-job," Professor Quirrell praised. "Thanks." Dazai's voice was garbled with sickness when he replied. Luckily, he was trained in putting on masks. He recovered almost immediately, standing up straighter and smiling sharply even though his intestines were still tied in knots. "Professor Quirrell is too nice. Can't you spread some of that kindness to my grades, sir?" The Dada professor's laugh was just about as shaky and fake-sounding as everything else the man did. I don't think that's going to happen, Mr. Dazai. Although I am quite a bit far behind on grading, so if you were to slip an old assignment on my desk, I wouldn't really notice the tardiness." Dazai raised a brow. Taking his eyes off Professor Quirrell once again, he scanned over the desk. As always, it was piled high with various textbooks, scrolls, and essays. Only a handful of them had the telltale red ink of a marked-up and graded assignment. One of the papers Dazai recognized as having been assigned over a month ago. It was completely bare of red ink, and looked to be one of Hermione's if the verbose, neat handwriting was any indication. "If you're so behind on grading, I'll do you a favor and not add to the load. Consider it my thank you for the extra lessons." Looking faintly amused, Quirrell merely nodded. Dazai loosened the grip on his wand and leaned back into a desk. "What's got you so behind, sir?" "All my other professors are on top of grading." The amusement withered quickly, and Quirrell tipped his nose up. "Just busy, I suppose," he said shortly. "Quite a lot of work that goes into being a TT teacher." Dazai looked up from the papers, then back to Quirrell. "Is that right?" He imagined quite a lot of work also went into doing whatever the hell it was that Quirrell was actually up to, like secret wizard mafia duties or screwing around with mountain trolls on campus. Not that it was any of Dazai's business. Mastering his newly discovered magical capabilities was more important than foiling a fellow schemer's plans for fun. Well, at least until something more interesting came along. He barely noticed when Professor Quirrell retreated to his desk. "Indeed." The professor said, "Perhaps we should stop now before you get sick." "Oh," Dazai said, blinking. "If you say so, sir, I do." Quirrell fussed over the papers on his desk in a way that made Dazai think he was just trying to look busy with his hands. "Now that you've mentioned it, Pete, perhaps I am a bit too far behind the other professors." As Quirrell sorted through the pages and pages of ungraded student essays, Dazai caught sight of a particular prompt he recognized. Hadn't that been the essay Blaze was trying to complete before it blew into the Forbidden Forest all those weeks ago? Remember what I said about the essays, now that winter break had settled the campus over with frost? With Draco off campus, Dazai wasn't going to risk sitting with the only Slytherins that had stayed behind. Professor Snape, Professor McGonagall, and a few other professors watched over the handful of students dining from their table at the head of the room. Quirrell still hadn't arrived. "Good evening, fellow winter break enthusiasts," he greeted, making room for himself directly beside Ron without warning. Or, what's the opposite of the go-home club? Fred and George both perked up from their meals to welcome him with joint waves. George answered him first. "After-school activities?" Fred added, "Is pranking considered a school-sanctioned activity? Because we have multiple detentions to prove that's not true." Dazai smirked and waved off their concerns. He slipped the strap of his book bag from his shoulder and placed it on his lap before turning to Ron. "So nice of you to join us." "Well, you did steal my book." "I did." Dazai nodded. At the reminder, he retrieved the stolen book from his bag and set it on the table beside Ron's plate. "You're welcome." The twins snickered. Glancing between his ragtag group of Gryffindor pranksters, Dazai couldn't help but grin. He steepled his fingers and looked out onto their amused faces. "Let's get down to business, shall we?" No one seemed to object to Dazai taking the leadership position. "Good." Fred leaned forward over the table. "What did you have in mind, my dear little Slytherin? For starters, Quirrell will be our target. By the end of winter break, I want him thoroughly fed up with us. Well, fed up with someone. Let's try not to get caught." The twins nodded enthusiastically. Not surprising, considering they had already planned to attack the professor at some point over the break. Ron, for his part, seemed a bit surprised. "What's Quirrell gonna do?" Fred snorted. "He's petrified of everything." Ron crossed his arms close to his chest. "I'm only a first year. I can't just go ruining my life by screwing with a teacher." Dazai snorted. "You've really been listening to all that stuff Hermione's always going on about, huh? Anyway, there are plenty of good reasons for targeting Quirrell. Also, I'm like 90% sure he won't have us expelled. When he was sure he had everyone's attention once, More Dazai began, perfunctory. Things we know about Professor Quirrell. He counted off on his fingers. He's a bad professor. He makes me do extra work. He's almost definitely in the wizard mafia. Also, he patted my shoulder once, and I still haven't forgiven him for that. I'm sorry, things we know. Wizard mafia? In line. He smirked. Here's a fun tidbit. Professor Quirrell is months behind on grading papers. Wouldn't it be such a shame if something were to happen to all of those ungraded essays? Dazai tutted. There it was, the spark of interest shining in Fred and George's eyes. Even Ron had perked up somewhat. Dazai fanned out his fingers, smiling serenely. He almost tried to channel some of Mori's blatant superiority, but it didn't really feel necessary, not with how closely his subordinates were hanging onto his every word. When Dazai leaned across the table, his band of red-headed idiots did as well. So here's the plan. Minerva McGonagall glanced up from her pasta with a blank expression. She raised a brow. You don't like anything, Severus. He ground his teeth, then gestured to the far corner of the Gryffindor table. Dazai and 3 of the Weasleys were hunched over their meals, chattering quietly amongst themselves. Every so often, one of them would make a vague gesture that Severus was almost afraid to identify. When Minerva followed his gaze, she sighed. They're conspiring. They're friends, she replied listless. It's not often you see a friendship between Gryffindors and a Slytherin. Despite how prickly and frightful most Hogwarts students perceived him to be, Snape did in fact care a great deal for his snakes. Of course he had noticed the unusual friendship that had formed between one of his students and some of McGonagall's. That sort of inter-house relationship was rare enough, but for it to involve Dazai Osamu of all people. There was a simple balance Severus had found between caring for his snakes and not knowing a thing about them. It was a careful division between, I'll do what I can to help you succeed, and, if I know your favorite food, I've gotten too attached. Dazai Osamu's favorite food was crab, and Snape had gotten too attached. They didn't talk. He hadn't fallen that far, but, well, there was just something about that kid. Maybe it was the inter-house friendships he seamlessly crafted. Maybe it was the complete and utter lack of magical talent. Maybe it was Madame Pomfrey knocking on his office door 20 minutes after curfew telling him about scars and starvation. Or maybe it was the fact that Quirinus Quirrell too had taken an interest in the boy. As he'd promised Poppy, Snape had started watching over Dazai more closely. He'd seen how the boy barely touched his meal unless it was crab, in which case he would scarf it down like digestion was going out of style. Snape had watched the boy scratch at his arms and stare blankly at walls. Had seen his eyes turn to stone when he thought no one was looking. Everything Snape saw he filed away, locked it up somewhere with a big bright red flag that waved back and forth and begged for attention that never seemed to come. And evidently Quirrell had been watching too. What that man had seen, Severus couldn't be sure. The boy was utterly lacking in skill. Sighing, Snape took a heavy swig from his drink. He set it down perhaps too harshly, and Minerva shot him a swift look. I'm going to speak with the headmaster. Keep an eye on those 4. McGonagall smiled thinly. Another red flag for the collection. Another silent worry. Snape turned away from the locked gaze quickly. He wasn't willing to answer to the amused interest in those eyes, though the expression did give him a moment's pause. He had a feeling that Dazai was the type to stick his nose where it didn't belong. The type to do well if he just sat down and applied himself. Pushing through the doors of the Great Hall, Snape hastily made his way through the corridors. Without any students around to block his way, Severus didn't even have to wear his cursory glare as he progressed. Instead, the expression he wore was thoughtful. Snape's interest in Dazai was one of concern, much to his displeasure. Quirrell's interest in Dazai was something. He let out a breath. The gargoyle guarding Dumbledore's office seemed to glare at him behind stone eyes. Snape tried to match that intensity with his voice to mixed results. Honeysuckle. As expected, the gargoyle stepped aside without complaint, revealing a stone spiral staircase in its place. It snapped shut with an echoing thud behind him. A caged phoenix perked up when Severus entered. Dumbledore was waiting for him, already seated behind his cluttered desk. Snape pointedly ignored the numerous trinkets, magical items, and tomes scattered about the room. Severus, it's always good to see you, the headmaster hummed, pleasant as always. However, if I'm not mistaken, you're to be at dinner right now. Dumbledore chuckled. I suppose we're both too invested in work to be taking breaks like that. What can I help you with? Albus's entire body seemed to sigh. He ran an aged hand through his long curled beard. We already spoke about this, Severus. It's best to keep him close for now. He's dangerous. He is, undoubtedly. But that doesn't change the situation. Snape grit his teeth, and his frustration bubbled to the surface. He mentally retracted 20 points from Gryffindor. It almost worked to calm him down. Almost. He took a long, suffering breath. Doesn't change the situation. Was it not an entirely separate issue for him to simply be loitering around the castle? Quirrell's taken interest in one of my snakes. Dumbledore's eyes narrowed. Osamu Dazai. He nodded. Standing, Albus crossed the room until he was crouched before the phoenix's cage. He reached in a finger to ruffle some of its sun-colored feathers. You are overreacting, Severus. There is a bigger plot at play. Tipping Quirrell off to our plan would only set unfortunate events in motion. Events we can't as easily control. For that man to take an interest in Dazai. Snape hissed. Does that not concern you at all? A feather fell to the ground. You're attached to the boy. He blinked, head snapping to the side. I protect my students. You do. And I admire that in you, Severus. The headmaster nodded. He cast a certain kind of shadow. But you lack a grasp for the bigger picture. Snape bared his teeth to a tapestry on the wall. It hovered over him like a heavy cloak. He didn't see Dumbledore's determined expression, nor the collapse of several more phoenix feathers. If he hurts my student. A small casualty in the war at hand, bigger picture. A burst of firelight lit the room for only a moment. Albus removed his hand from the birdcage, unwilling to stroke the pile of ashes that remained. Snape was sure the phoenix would be reborn within the day, but he could never stand the ghastly cries it made upon waking. What picture was bigger than the Dark Lord's servant taking an interest in one of Snape's students? Wait for Quirrell to make his move. Dumbledore's voice was a gavel. Do not attempt to remove the student from his influence. There are too many unknown variables still at play. What's the worst that one boy can do? 35 after-school activities. Oh, come on, Dazai whined, tugging on Ron's sleeve insistently. This is hardly the worst thing I've done. The ginger let himself be waved around. That's not reassuring at all. He stooped lower, trying to peer up from under his bangs and into Ron's averted eyes. Please, I promise you won't get implicated in the prank if you do a good job. A good job, right. Come on, Ron, Fred said, stepping up behind his younger brother and placing an arm on his back. George nodded. You already agreed to help. Besides, I'm sure Dazai won't let you get into too much trouble. I, for one, trust him completely. Fred agreed easily. He nudged Ron forward, sending the boy tumbling to Dazai's side. Dazai reached out to steady Ron's shoulders. Smiling pleasantly, he brushed some invisible lint off of the Gryffindor's winter cloak. It's a simple plan. It's not like you can mess it up. Stop worrying so much. If it's so simple, Ron smacked the hand away lightly, then why do I need to help? I'm trying to include you. That seems like the sort of thing a good friend would do, or a gang leader trying to strengthen the loyalty of his subordinates. It was all kind of the same thing, to be honest. Oi! Fred and George shared a brief look. They smirked, then saddled themselves at each of Dazai's sides like two protective guard dogs. You have to help him because we already have a job in this prank, Ronnykins, they explained. And he's going to get lost if we let him wander off alone. Ron blinked. His eyes widened ever so slightly as the reality of that sentence sunk in. Almost immediately, the fight lining Ron's shoulders seemed to dissipate. Oh, Merlin, you're right. Linking his fingers behind his back, Dazai watched Ron's willpower wither and die. It wasn't until the twins were wearing triumphant grins that he decided it was time to move things along. Dazai cleared his throat. 3 pairs of eyes flashed to him. Now that everyone is back on board, he passed a casually critical gaze in Ron's direction. Let's get moving. Curfew is in about 30 minutes, so we'll have to hurry. Roger that, Snakey. They saluted. For you by then. Again, the twins merely nodded along. Dazai felt a thrill of eagerness flow up in him. Was this his first big job as a gang leader? It was starting to feel like it. It was a shame that his second-in-command wasn't here to enjoy the rush of a successful job, but Dazai supposed it wasn't really official until they had a gang name. It also probably wasn't official until he actually told his gang members that they were in a gang. Well, one thing at a time. Whirling on his feet, Dazai offered a wide smile to Ron. "All right, lead the way, friend." Drawing himself together, Ron gestured for Dazai to follow. He did, grinning. With a final wave goodbye to the twins, the mafioso scampered off down the halls, in, presumably, the general direction of Quirrell's office. Once they had turned the corner, leaving Fred and George out of sight, Dazai skipped ahead to match Ron's pace. They walked in relative silence for a few minutes. "Ah, we're here," Dazai hummed. He took a few steps ahead of Ron to grab at the office's door handle. "Great job, Ron." "It's not that impressive," the redhead replied, scratching the back of his head. "You're just bad at this." "Well, that's true. Hey, do you think Professor Quirrell is in? To be honest, I haven't got a clue how to get him out if he is." "Wah," Ron squeaked. "I thought you had this whole thing planned out." Ignoring the objection, Dazai was already pulling the door open. The disapprovals spilling from Ron's mouth were immediately smothered as his mouth clamped shut. The ginger's eyes worriedly flipped between Dazai and the empty hallway. Dazai peeked his head behind the door. "I do." "Isn't it more fun to not know everything, though?" He hummed and rolled back on his feet to face Ron. "It's fine anyway. No one is here." "Oh, fantastic. Those two can handle this themselves, then." He shut the door with a quiet click, using his palm to brace the sound. "We're still going to find Professor Quirrell, otherwise he'll catch the twins in the middle of our prank." Dazai waved his hand dismissively. "And I've already told them to rat us out if they get caught, so we should probably get looking." Ron's mouth dropped open, but it snapped shut seconds later. "You're insane," he grumbled. "I can't believe someone like you gets an owl when I only get that stupid rat." Startled from his ramblings when Ron suddenly speed-walked to the other end of the hall. "Angel, there you are. Where have you been, mate?" Dazai followed after Ron at a lame pace, craning his neck to see the thin black rat that was perched on a windowsill. It blinked two languid eyelids at him. Gross. Angel tilted its head back as if in greeting. "Oi," Ron barked. "I've been looking for him for ages. Thought for sure he was never going to come back." Dazai quirked a brow. Ron stood his ground. "He's coming with us while we look for Quirrell. I'm not letting him out of my sight till we get back to the common rooms." Angel seemed to smirk, which was every bit as obnoxious as Ron's triumphant grin. Dazai felt his lips twitch. "To be clear, I'm only agreeing as an act of great kindness on my part." "Sure." "I don't like Angel. I want that on the record." Ron shot him a look, reaching out to hug Angel between two palms. "There is no record, Dazai. It's just us here. I don't think Angel even knows what you're saying. He's pretty dumb." As if in response, Angel blinked again. Its body was eerily still. If Dazai wasn't glaring down at it, he was sure it would be impossible to tell the damn thing was even breathing. With an overdramatic, frustrated sigh, Dazai relented. "Fine," he whined. "I'll carry him so he doesn't wander off again." Ron smiled, looking distinctly amused. The clear fondness on his subordinate's face drew a grin onto Dazai's. Striding forward, Dazai reached his hand out to pinch Angel's fur and pluck him out of Ron's grip. However, the moment before he could touch the rat, it shot out of Ron's cupped hands and scampered noisily onto the floor. "Angel." Ron stumbled over himself as he bent over to attempt to collect the black rat once again. It sidestepped the attempt with nimble feet, quickly scurrying across the cold tile further away from the two. Dazai blinked. "Your rat is so weird. Help me catch him." The mafioso stalled for only a moment as Ron pounded down the hall after Angel. Once it reached the end of the hall, Angel stood on its haunches and turned. Dazai could almost convince himself it was watching, waiting for a response. But it was just a rat, a stupid one at that. He spared a brief glance to Professor Quirrell's office. Fine. But make it quick. His first job as a gang leader wouldn't be a bust because of some stupid rat. Dazai trailed after the duo a bit more speedily than his lazy expression may have suggested. Ron reached Angel before Dazai did, but once the Gryffindor was close enough to catch him, Angel scurried off again. Dazai huffed. He had to skip to catch up once the two had rounded the corner. "Ugh, you two slow down." Dazai's face was smothered by black cloth. He stumbled backwards quickly, slipping into a defensive stance unconsciously. Dazai's hands were halfway to shielding his face when his brain caught up to his eyes. Ron was standing just to his left, looking worried, but not afraid. At his feet, Angel was sitting primly and watching Dazai with cold eyes. They seemed fine. They weren't hurt, but then... Who had Dazai just run into while turning the blind corner? Dazai blinked and lowered his hands. Oh. He'd run straight into Professor Quirrell. Ah, the mafioso mumbled. He willed himself to look more composed than he felt at that moment. They had just bumped into each other. It wasn't an attack. The thought stung. Sir. The Dada professor was frowning down at him, wearing an expression somewhere between confusion, uncertainty, and concern. So, that was normal. He ran a shaking hand over his chest where the cloth had been wrinkled by Dazai's face smashing into it. Mr. Dazai. And Mr. W. Weasley. He hesitated, looking around nervously. Finally, his eyes settled back on Dazai, whose nose was turning an impressive shade of red. That stung too. Are you all right, my boy? Dazai resisted the urge to rub at his face. I'm fine, sir. I should be asking you that considering it was me who ran into you. Not entirely true, of course. But Dazai was always willing to suck up to someone if he needed to. Especially if that someone was coincidentally also the victim of your latest prank. Speaking of... Ron, Dazai barked, bouncing on his heels pleasantly and smirking when the Gryffindor jumped. Why don't you tell Professor Quirrell why we're out so late? I'm sure he's thinking about giving us a detention since curfew is in. The redhead floundered for a second. Ah, my rat. Angel wandered off and we were just looking for him is all. While Quirrell was briefly distracted by Ron's flimsy excuse, Dazai allowed himself to search his gaze around the hall. Professor Quirrell's office wasn't in sight. Good. Still, it was a precarious situation. Dazai was standing just at the edge of where the hall turned. If Professor Quirrell tried to step past him, he would be able to see his office easily. The twins may be experts, but if Dazai gave even an inch here, they would be seen straight away. The integrity of the entire plan hinged on Dazai keeping Quirrell from taking one step forward. He shuffled a bit closer to Quirrell, consciously closing in the barrier. Dazai tuned back into the conversation, in time to see that Ron had finally recaptured Angel, and was letting the rat rest on his shoulder. Professor Quirrell was listening to Ron's explanation with a look of abstract bewilderment. So that's why we're out, around here. Can't this wait until tomorrow? About the Verdimillious charm, he deflected easily. I think I've pretty much mastered the basics, don't you think? I mean, I haven't thrown up in a while and that feels like good improvement. I was wondering if we could move on to some other spell, like a killing curse. I really don't have time tonight, Mr. Dazai. Quirrell snapped. He made to push past Dazai once again. In the corner of his vision, Dazai saw Ron go still. It was brief, and moments later Ron bit back. You don't have time for your favorite student? Both Dazai and Quirrell turned to stare at him. He's not my favorite. The professor stumbled. I don't play favorites with my students. Ron somehow looked equally surprised with himself for snapping at his professor. Still, he barreled on. Well, Dazai is the only one you give extra lessons to, right? I know Hermione's been hounding all of our professors about it, but she's not getting remedial lessons practically every night. Oh. Ron was much more clever than Dazai had thought. He'd not only picked up on the fact that Dazai was the only student getting remedial lessons, but that there was something distinctly unusual about the scenario as a whole. Dazai felt himself grinning unwittingly. Not only that, but Ron had completely shaken what confidence Quirrell had managed to scrounge up. He was shaping up to be a promising subordinate more and more every day. Ron had aimed his unexpectedly sharp intellect in Dazai's defense without any extensive manipulations on the latter's part. Chest with a light thwump. Ah, shit. When Ron had regained his bearings and steadied Dazai on his feet, he hurried to follow after the professor, an objection heavy on his lips. Quirrell sped hurriedly across the hall straight towards his office. The twins were surely already inside, just seconds away from being caught. That was no good. Ron's mouth was half open with the harsh call of "Professor" below his tongue when Dazai put his hand out. Ron halted immediately. Dazai gestured to Quirrell. The professor was still hurrying away, evidently in a rush to get to his office. Only he was walking straight past his office and down the hall. Blinking, Dazai let himself fall back into a more casual position. Beside him, Ron untensed as well. At the other end of the hall, Professor Quirrell disappeared behind a corner. Ah, he let out a breath. I thought our prank was foiled for sure. But he wasn't even going to his office. Ron's whole body seemed to deflate. I'm really going to get suspended for hanging out with you, he bemoaned absently. A second later, the boy's own words seemed to register. Without warning, he punched Dazai in the arm. That's for nearly getting us expelled. And not actually having a plan at all. I had a plan, Dazai mumbled. It was distract Quirrell. Well, you didn't execute the plan. Angel's whiskers twitched. He'd already distracted himself. Doing. Whatever it is he's doing right now. 20 minutes to curfew. Dazai trailed off. What is he doing this late? Ron huffed, raising his pointer finger to rub under Angel's chin. Who cares? Also, you remember the rules of our friendship, don't you? Sure. I try my very best to ignore all of them. Fantastic, he deadpanned. Rule number 4, please never make me do a prank with you again. No? Dazai smirked. You looked like you were having fun. Didn't it feel nice to bully your teacher? They turned the corner and Quirrell's office disappeared from view. The twins probably had everything covered without them keeping sentry. Hopefully. Dazai had just caught wind of something much more interesting to investigate. Rule 6, Ron continued. Angel is a part of our friend group now. Be nicer to him. Absolutely not. 36. The Forbidden Forest. How are those two doing out there? Fred shrugged, craning his neck around a mountain's worth of ungraded essays stacked on top of Quirrell's desk. Guess squirrely Quirrell Y is closer to entering his office than we thought. He hummed. Sure are a lot of essays here. Kid wasn't joking. George hummed in passive agreement as he mentally rolled over their plan. Now that they'd snuck into their professor's office with Ron and Dazai outside distracting Quirrell, the next step was, well, we should hurry up then. Nodding, Fred withdrew his wand from his cloak. Beside him, George did the same. They each pointed their wands at the massively tall stacks of ungraded student essays. With a swish, a flick, and a few muttered phrases, their magic was cast. At once, the papers burst into life. They took to the air, flutter and flapping about like paper swallows circling the desk. Fred beamed. Animating the essays so Quirrell can't catch them, brilliant. By the time Professor Quirrell would realize that he'd never be able to catch the animated essays, they would have all burnt up. A truly devious plan, really. Not only was it a truly clever prank, but it was helping out their fellow students as well. Kid really has a flair for the dramatic, huh? George hummed, a large grin splitting his face as he watched the essays circle over his head. A particularly thick chunk of papers flopped noisily past him. Those pages must have gotten stuck together somehow. After all, no one would write more than 6 pages for a silly data assignment. Fred pretended to wipe a tear from under his eye. They grow up so fast, embarrassing like Quirrell's diary. Well, we were going to sneak around anyway. That's true. With a shared grin, the twins split off from one another to search the office. They opened drawers, lifted tomes, flipped through personal notes. Ah, Fred said after a minute. He was hunched over a large crate tucked underneath Quirrell's desk. It was pulled out somewhat so that the ginger could look inside. What is this? George peeked over his shoulder. His eyes immediately shot wide open once he caught a look at what was inside the box. That, my dear twin, is something very, very interesting. Meanwhile, the papers were fighting for airspace overhead. Hermione's essay was winning. It had a lot more bulk to work with. Rule 21. It's the principle of the thing, Ron announced. He'd taken the lead in following Professor Quirrell's trail at some point. The hallways were barely lit by a line of wavering torchlights, lending their nighttime escapades a pair of long shadows. Every time a flame flickered, the shadows would skip across the stone floors. Rule 21. Follow rules 1 through 21. Dazai smirked. Just those ones? Rule 22. Shut up. He hummed. I don't think I will. Ron shot him a look somewhere between annoyance and fondness. Dazai watched the boy's expression shift through the corner of his eye. Shouldn't you be watching the halls? We're out after curfew now, you know. Filch is bound to be around somewhere. In response, Ron patted Angel's head. I'll just say we were running after Angel again. Devious. It was, in a Ron sort of way. He didn't really seem the type to instigate nefarious plans like Dazai or his prankster brothers. But once Ron was caught up in something with you, he was there to stay. It was somewhat reassuring. A good trait to have in a subordinate. Well, that would ruin all the fun. As it was, however, Quirrell was some ways ahead of them. That gave Dazai the barest of confidences that he could hold an entire conversation without being caught. Mori would say he was being overconfident. Mori wasn't here right now. Dazai spared the briefest of glances to Angel, who met his eyes head-on. He looked away immediately to watch the door numbers grow increasingly smaller as they walked. Angel would make a good excuse to be wandering out this late. Maybe that stupid rat really did belong in his gang like Ron had suggested. He huffed. We've been walking for a while now. Are you sure Quirrell went this way? They passed a creaking suit of armor. For a moment, Dazai thought it was going to spring to life, but it held resolutely still. Those twins are always going on about their pranks. It'd be pretty tough not to pick up some. Dazai wondered what sort of other nightly escapades Fred and George must have gotten up to for them to learn such a neat little tidbit. Maybe that was an inquiry for when they weren't actively engaging in a reconnaissance mission. Dazai filed that one away for later when he had a little less on his plate. Instead, the mafioso watched Ron easily navigate Quirrell's candle trail with a reassessing eye. Ron Weasley was just full of surprises tonight. Ah, you're no fun. Dazai pouted and kicked up his feet. Then he blinked. Oh, he turned here. Sure enough, where the hallway diverged into two paths, only one side was lit by torches. Ron hummed, and they took the red-hued right path over the dark one to the left. What's down this way, Ron? More classrooms? Damn, he needed a map. A few. Also, well, Ron worked well enough too. The torches lead them to the door. It was snowing. We aren't following him outside, are you crazy? Ron squeaked, voice barely above a whisper. When Dazai stepped past the threshold into the winter night, Ron hurried to catch up. Behind them, the doors slammed shut with the force of the weather. Dazai shot him a wry grin. A little. He tucked his hands into his sleeves when a sudden gust of snowy wind bit at his nose. And so are you for following me. Ah, is your rat going to be okay? Angel didn't look his way. It stared off blankly into the distance. Ron answered in its stead. He can sit in my cloak if he gets too cold, or maybe he'll just run off again. With any luck. Chuckling, Dazai turned his gaze from Angel's frozen frame to the snowy landscape around them. Sure enough, there was a trail of shoe prints in the snow headed down the hill. Though, he traced the path as best he could in the darkness. Ron shook with a sudden chill. What? Hagrid's hut is that way, isn't it? There was a plume of chimney smoke beaconing the groundskeeper's building. The cold that barraged Dazai's face stung a bit more at the thought of sitting by an open fire. When Ron followed Dazai's pointing finger, he continued. I thought so. Look, Quirrell didn't go that way. He went. It really was hard to see in the dark. Luckily, Dazai had fairly good vision. Consider it a product of practice aiming a gun at incredibly small targets for hours on end. But what was he aiming at tonight? Oh, target acquired. Dazai perked up when he found the trail's destination, but immediately regretted it when the wind stung at his exposed neck. He huddled back into his cloak. He went into the Forbidden Forest. My Slytherin friends and I hang out near here all the time. Didn't know there was a door so close, though. Ron glanced at him, then back to the forest before grimacing. I have the distinct feeling that I know where this is going. The Forbidden Forest is forbidden, Dazai. Thanks for the recap. You're coming in with me, right? Dazai hummed, overlaying his snowy tracks with Quirrell's. He hopped into the next one, then glanced over his shoulder to smile Ron's way. Why are you so insistent on following Professor Quirrell? Ron asked instead. When a particularly rough gust of wind blew past, the red head put a protective hand over his shoulder where Angel was perched. The rat, unprompted, crawled into its owner's sleeve. Reconnaissance, he corrected absently. Ah, just thinking aloud. Don't worry about it. Ron stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. I'm very much worrying about that, don't bother. Granted, killing the first troll had really knocked Dazai's brains around, but, well, magic got easier to more he practiced. Maybe killing magic creatures with no longer human worked the same, like Professor Quirrell. It's bloody cold out here. You do it. I'm fairly certain that you'll have to carry me back to the castle if I try anything like that. Ron paused, his face paling. Dazai thought he must have been recalling their last experience with his magic at the owlery. That had sure been fun. Well, as much fun as sending a letter to Mori could be. Ah ha ha, I'm counting on you, Ron. Do your best. Dazai cheered enthusiastically. Otherwise I'll probably get lost and die without you. Actually, I'm not averse to that. On second thought, Dazai felt it before he saw it, the magic swirling around the tip of Ron's wand. A small bright light sparked to life at the end of the stick hazily. It was small enough that the light barely helped to see through the snow. Ron pointed his stick at the snow until the footprints were visible once again. Thanks, Dazai commented, following the tracks once again. You're welcome. Luckily, the snow wasn't compact enough to crunch under their treading shoes. Dazai was already weary that they were being too obvious about stalking Professor Quirrell into the forbidden forest. It was only thanks to the gusting white wind that he was sure they wouldn't be heard or seen. Of course, that was a double-edged sword. Dazai wouldn't know where Quirrell was until they were right on top of him. He ground his teeth. Somewhere to their left, a bramble thicket rustled noisily. Ron jumped, drawing closer to Dazai's side and reaching out for him. Dazai narrowly avoided making skin contact. Wouldn't want to cut that Lumos spell out now. Do you see to that? Dazai didn't wait to see if Ron did as he was instructed. His attention was focused solely on peering around the brush to see who was there. The two figures were still huddled together and talking lowly with one another. Good. Neither figure had noticed that they had a hidden audience. Yet, feeling around him sightlessly, Dazai tugged down Ron's sleeve until the lion was pulled into his side behind a bush. The boy let himself be pushed into the thorny shelter obediently. A perfect hiding spot for some perfect intel gathering. Hogwarts was feeling more and more like the Port Mafia as the year went by. 37 Mystery. The whistling wind pulled the barren branches of tall, dark trees like it was drawing a marionette overhead. It cast the ground in shadow. Only the neon white of snow marked where the air stopped and the forest floor began. The force of the weather made it hard to breathe, and the nipping ice rooted everything in place. Also, it sucked. I forgot my scarf. Dazai whined. Shh! They'll hear us, pea-brain. His winter cloak was not helping at all, and Angel wouldn't huddle under his clothes like a portable space heater with claws. Dazai looked to the two mysterious figures again. They hadn't moved. Maybe they were frozen in place too. It's fine, he insisted, ducking into his collar. They can't hear us. Hell, we can't hear them. It's too windy. Can I borrow Angel, please? Everything stopped. Must have momentarily escaped his notice. Dazai also tensed up, feeling a cold spiral of fear bite at his spine. All of the cold-racking Dazai's body was chased away by stark, numb fear. He hadn't been paying enough attention, even after charging all the way down here with such confidence. That had been Quirrell's voice. Father would be disappointed. He'd been taught better than to bicker so uselessly while doing recon of all things. Caught before he'd even really started. I can assure you, Quirinus, you had nothing. I have taken the liberty of placing a charm around the area to ward off intruders. Another voice. Familiar but muffled behind the wind as it picked back up. Some stray creature, perhaps. Who was that? The familiarity of the voice tickled the back of Dazai's skull. Also, the area was charmed. That must have been what activated no longer human. Some sort of area-based effect to prevent entrance. It was good luck that whoever this mysterious person was hadn't noticed their spell canceling out. Dazai shook his head. One thing at a time. I don't know why you wanted to meet here of all PL places. Dazai couldn't make out the other figure's response behind the gusting weather, but neither of the cloaked individuals seemed keen on investigating what Quirrell had heard. He and Ron were still undetected, for now. He strained against the wind to make out what was being said. Dazai only caught the last bit of the unknown man's next sentence. Students aren't supposed to know about the Philosopher's Stone, after all. Philosophers. Stone? Distracted by the lack of comprehension in his friend's eyes, Dazai again only caught the final few words of what the stranger said next. He did recognize that voice. Quirrell's voice was hidden behind a sudden gust of wind, but the other man's oily reply was not. If their potential is a bit difficult to see at times. Oh, they were definitely talking about him. Dazai strained against the weather, hoping to hear more about what Quirrell thought of him. Certainly, that had been a similar question on Dazai's mind. What had gotten Quirrell so interested in him? Unfortunately, the wind only let up in time for Dazai to catch the tail end of Snape's final sentence. Decided where your loyalties lie. With that, Snape flipped the hood of his cloak up. Face hidden in shadow, the potions master whirled on his feet and exited the clearing in the opposite direction of where Dazai and Ron were hiding, without giving Quirrell even a second to respond. They held their breaths, waiting for Professor Quirrell to follow. Quirrell stood in silence for nearly a minute before following in the direction that Snape had disappeared down. Or, no, that hadn't been silence exactly. But with the wind roaring around him, Dazai wasn't able to make out what Quirrell was mumbling to himself. It was another moment after Quirrell was gone that Dazai felt himself untense completely. What in Merlin's name was all that? Well, that summed everything up nicely. Dazai met Ron's eyes and did the only thing he could do. Not a clue. Something interesting for sure. Dazai tried to rub the exhaustion from his eyes to no effect. He'd spent all last night lying awake in bed, running over what he and Ron had overheard in the forest. Whatever Professor Quirrell was up to, it was much bigger than Dazai had anticipated. But as it was, Dazai didn't have enough information to decide where he stood. Was it worth interfering, like he'd originally planned to? Or was this philosopher's stone too high profile? It was too hard to say. Dazai didn't want to risk outing himself as an ability user, and he certainly didn't want to alert the magical community to the Port Mafia's intentions. But then again, did Dazai really have a choice? At least part of the reason Quirrell and Snape met last night was to discuss him. That had to be significant. And Dazai wasn't usually one to just let something like that go. Unfortunately, he hated going into this mess blind less than he liked having Quirrell's attention. It was the greater evil of the two, at least as far as Dazai could see. He bit his lip, deep in thought. Someone bumped his shoulder. When Dazai looked up from his musings, Ron was watching him with pinched brows. Dazai smiled wearily and drew his knees up to his chest. One of the best things about winter break was that the castle was very nearly empty. It was a bit easier to breathe without so many eyes around. This meant, of course, that Dazai was a little bit more free in where he wandered. Draco would have his head if he knew that, at that very moment, Dazai was sitting on the floor beside the Gryffindor fireplace. The twins had managed to smuggle Dazai into the Gryffindor common rooms by virtue that no one was there to stop them. Compared to the Slytherin common rooms, these ones were much warmer. Dazai could only really describe his current surroundings as cozy. There were soft, red sofas and armchairs spread about the room, but Dazai's group had settled for kneeling on the floor rug. Warm sunlight filtered in through the windows. Fred and George were currently piling up a stack of wrapped boxes, each one labeled with a Weasley's name on it. The sunlight caught on the various colored ribbons and wrapping paper. Dazai tried to amuse himself with their antics, but Quirrell's conversation with Snape last night was still buzzing around in his head. "Oi," Ron mumbled quietly. "Quit thinking so much. Let's just enjoy Christmas, mate." George made a noise of agreement as he reached over to drop a present into his little brother's lap. "You're not worried we'll get caught, are you? You did a great job distracting Professor Quirrell. I don't think he ever went to his office last night." Ron and Dazai shared a quick look. "I wouldn't stress about it." Fred added, smirking devilishly. "Anyway, we have something very interesting to share about last night. You're gonna love it, Snakey." Dazai blinked. "Did you find something in Quirrell's office? Maybe this philosopher's stone thing?" The twins merely grinned. While those two finished picking their own presents out, Dazai turned to Ron. "Is that stupid rat of yours around?" he asked over his knees. Ron sighed. "Ran off again after last night. Once I got back to bed, he scampered off to Merlin knows where." "You don't think he's raiding the kitchens, do you?" "I could get in serious trouble for that." Dazai shrugged. "I wouldn't put it past Angel." "So," he gestured to the presents strewn about. "What's this then? Don't tell me it's the infamous Weasley Christmas sweaters I heard so much about?" The other boy grinned sheepishly. He waited until the twins had settled in, then tore off the wrapping paper with a certain kind of vigor. In sync, all three Weasley brothers pulled out an overlarge red sweater from their respective box. On the face of each shirt, a letter was stitched in. R for Ron's, F for Fred's, and G for George's. Dazai smirked at the weary expression on Ron's face. "It's nice," he hummed pleasantly. "Is the R so you don't forget your name?" The mafioso shook himself, then watched, amused, As the boys went through the presents their parents had sent, Fred and George flipped through stacks of candy and various items that Dazai was fairly sure would be used for pranking at some point. Much to his surprise, even Dazai himself had gotten some candy, a single chocolate frog from Hermione. He had let it hop away dispassionately, thinking that maybe Angel would come around sometime and choke on it. Ron was halfway through a box of chocolates when he suddenly blinked up from his goods. He turned to Dazai, mouth stuffed and smeared with sweets. "Did Merfolf geff you anything?" "Oh," Dazai snorted. Fred and George already looked deeply upset before Dazai had even begun to shake his head. Of course he didn't get anything for Christmas. The most he might ever receive for some trivial holiday would be a ruffled dress from Maury and a new scar from Father. Honestly. Being so high up in the Mafia didn't leave either of them much room for silly traditions. But the Weasley kids wouldn't want to hear about that. Dazai pasted on a smile instead. "Ah, well, I did get a letter from Maury." He patted the chest of his cloak where the folded parchment was tucked away. "Haven't read it yet, though. It's probably something tedious." The twins caught each other's eyes. Some sort of silent message passed between them. After a moment, they both turned their full attention back to Dazai. When they did, there was something heavy and protective in their expressions. It was kind of gross. It was also just the sort of loyalty Dazai liked to see in his subordinates. The twins were really just the gifts that kept on giving. Dazai felt his lips twitch upwards. "Remember what we said about something interesting happening last night?" When Dazai nodded, George continued. "Everyone's favorite squirrel Quirrell was hiding something in his office." Fred tisked playfully. He winked. With one fluid movement, both twins reached behind the pile of discarded presents. They grabbed something and lifted it with a look of concentration on their faces like it was somewhat heavy. They held the item aloft for only a moment before setting it down on the rug between them. Fred and George wore matching proud grins, the beam to Dazai as if waiting for a reaction. The item that the twins found in Quirrell's office. Dazai blinked. It was a medium-sized black object, big enough to fill all four of Fred and George's combined hands. Though he didn't reach out to touch it just yet, the item seemed to radiate heat. It altogether gave off the appearance of being a large piece of shiny charcoal. Only. Every so often, Dazai could just barely make out the slightest of movements, a slight shift in position closer to the open fireplace. It looked almost like "You," Merlin's beard. Ron gasped. The twins glanced to one another, then shrugged. "Not a clue, mate." Dazai made a thoughtful noise deep in his throat. Unfortunately, identifying magical creatures hadn't been the main focus of his studies. He told Ron and the twins as much, though obviously held his tongue about what he had actually been studying at the time. He didn't think they would much appreciate the fact that he was researching why he could kill a troll with a single touch. "Ah," the twins whined. But they didn't seem to be all that upset about it. Shame. Realizing that Ron had been quiet for quite some time, Dazai shifted his attention to the other first year. Ron's eyes were wide as he stared down at the mystery egg. It was swaying in time with the flickering flames beside them. Curious. Dazai crooned. "What's that face for?" "Sats." Interested, the twins leaned over the egg so that their faces were right in front of Ron's. Dazai perked up slightly. "You recognize it, huh? Guess Ron really is useful. That dragon nonsense Charlie spouts out." When he caught Dazai's curious pout, Ron added, "Our older brother. He's off studying dragons in Romania." "Ah, see how it's leaning towards the fire like that? Only dragon eggs do that, I think. Something about needing fire to hatch." Dazai was the one to break the silence. "You're secretly a genius. Weirdly observant. I don't know how to feel about that." Thanks, mate." Ron flushed. "I think," Dazai shrugged. He easily turned his focus back to the egg. "Quirrell had this?" he asked, after a moment. Under his breath, Dazai muttered, "Why? Not a clue." "But you like solving mysteries, don't you?" Dazai frowned. Brows pinched. He squinted up at the twins. "What makes you think that?" Fred and George seemed to pause for a moment, looking startled at the question. George cleared his throat, then smiled half-heartedly. "Well, you two got back awful late last night. Figured you were snooping around." "Right. It hadn't been that late. Though maybe Ron returning to their common room covered in snow had tipped them off to something." Fred waved off Dazai's obvious skepticism. Or what were you two up to anyway? Dazai ignored the way that Ron's eyes sought him out. He grinned lazily. Snooping around, obviously. The twins beamed. Obviously. He shot a brief look in Ron's direction, but it looked as if the Gryffindor was going to take his lead on this one. Dazai silently considered the merits of not involving the twins in this Quirrell conspiracy. Was there a benefit to keeping them in the dark? Fred and George smiled amicably at him, eyes shining with obvious mischief and curiosity. The dragon's egg swayed. Well, they were a part of his gang, weren't they? No point in leaving some of his most trusted gang members behind, was there? The twins blinked in perfect sync. They briefly met eyes. Ahem, Snape who's up to something, Dazai huffed. How so? With a nod, Dazai caught the twins up on what they had heard in the woods the night before. It wasn't much, given how the wind had obscured much of the conversation, but it was enough. Fred and George listened with rapt interest, brows scrunching together in thought every few seconds. When Dazai mentioned the Philosopher's Stone, there wasn't even a flicker of recognition on their faces. Anyway, Dazai summed up, Quirrell is obviously up to something dangerous. You don't have a secret meeting in a forest unless you're a criminal. Ron shot him a look. And given that Snape was there, we know he's a threat to Hogwarts, and whatever this Philosopher's Stone thing is. But Snape isn't wizard mafia, so we know he's not a problem. Try to keep up, genius. Dazai, mate, Ron said, sounding exasperated. You can't say you don't want me as your enemy in a good way. Snape is up to something. Yes, you can. You're just not trying hard enough. Hey, Fred interrupted, looking vaguely amused. Dazai's mouth snapped shut. Both he and Ron turned their full attention to where the twins were sitting. No bickering, you two. George clapped a hand down on each of their shoulders. Under his breath, he muttered, Merlin, being a big brother is tough work. He smiled, then spoke directly to them. The whole thing is suspicious. Let's agree on that. Dazai, Fred continued amicably. Why are we sure that Snape isn't a threat to Hogwarts in this Phil Stone thing? Because he isn't one? He's investigating Quirrell, too. Along with the rest of the staff here, if I had to guess. At the look of blank surprise flitting across everyone's faces, Dazai bit his lip. Only I'm not sure of all the pieces at play here. But it's serious enough to get Snape worried at least. And that guy doesn't even get worried when I blow up potions every day. Ron's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't look fully convinced. Shouldn't we leave this to the professors then? I resent that. Fred poked the egg, knocking it back and forth. That is a good point. George hummed. How did Quirrell get his hands on something like that? Because he's a criminal with shady connections. Dazai smirked. As I said, wizard mafia. Suspicious, the twins chimed. Point 1 for Dazai's wizard mafia theory. He'll notice it's missing. Ron persisted. I don't want to get in trouble for having Quirrell's dragon egg. When the fire danced, the egg danced with it. Dazai felt his grin turn to a point. If he tells the professors about it, we'll just tell them who we got it from. They're already suspicious of him, so they'll obviously take our side. No, he wouldn't be that stupid. He'll know that we have it, though. True. Their prank hadn't exactly been subtle. Loudly parading Quirrell away from his office had blatantly spelled out at least half of the culprits. And honestly, it wasn't hard to figure out the twins were involved. It was only a matter of time now before Quirrell confronted someone about the theft. But Dazai knew criminals like he knew the back of his hand, because his was a very criminal hand. Quirrell wouldn't risk the extra attention on himself, not when he was already in deep trouble with Snape. Whatever was going on there was serious business, Dazai knew. No, he would go straight for the thieves responsible. Well, if he wants it back, he's going to have to catch it first. The Weasleys frowned at him in obvious confusion. What does that mean? We're going to hide the egg from him? Ooh. The twins cheered. Blackmail. Hide it? No, no, no. Dazai's teeth looked sharper in the firelight. We're going to hatch it. 38 the honorary Gryffindor. Dazai, you've made so much progress. I'm so proud. I'm a bit worried about you getting sick so often, though. You've always been such a fragile child, haven't you? I'll have to give you a nice long checkup once you're home, okay? Although I'm afraid I may have to vie for your father's attention for you. He misses you very much, so hurry home. Honestly, if he threatens to wage war on Hogwarts for stealing you away one more time, I may have to usurp his position myself. I'm just joking. Please don't have your owl do something horrible to my office again. In the meantime, keep practicing your magic. I'm sure you'll have something impressive to show me by the time you return to Yokohama. And keep pursuing this philosopher's stone business. It all sounds very interesting to me. I'm sure the Port Mafia could benefit from all the work you're doing over there. Collect it for me, if you can. Are you staying out of trouble, Osamu? Mem. The letter sat buried beneath a stack of books on dragon rearing. I'm not sick. Dazai gestured helplessly. Drained. I'm a bit drained, from practicing like the good subordinate I am. He paused. Also maybe from standing out in the snow for an hour without a coat. I don't really know how this works. Blaze was the first to stride forward. He planted himself firmly at the arm of Dazai's chair. Didn't I tell you to take care of yourself while we were gone? I don't remember that. Blaze huffed. He reached the back of his arm out to Dazai's head, then pulled back at the heat radiating from there. He turned back to Draco wordlessly. Well, Draco said, brows pulled tight together in something like wary consideration. You wouldn't have gotten sick if you'd just gone home for winter break. Then you could have come to this year's famous Malfoy holiday party with the rest of us. That way we could have kept you in line. Parties are boring, boss. Pansy made a haughty noise. As if your father would even let mudblood trash like him through the doors. Boo, Dazai whined, before Draco could respond. Pansy is boring too, boss. He threw an arm over his eyes. Even in the dimmed lights of the Slytherin common room, the flickering fireplace was giving him a headache. At least Dazai knew that Ron was faring better, after all. He didn't have remedial lessons with Professor Quirrell every other day. Ron also didn't have a nullifying ability to work against. So, kudos to him. Although, in light of recent events and a particular stolen egg, Dazai figured Ron was busy enough as it was. Don't tell me you don't love it. I won't believe you. She sighed. Dazai reveled in how utterly displeased she sounded. Then he choked on another cough. You should go to the infirmary, Draco said, voice contemplative. I don't want you getting me sick. Dazai made a long, grumbling moan. Not sick, boss. Right. You're drained, whatever the hell that means. Go to the nurse. I'd rather just lie here forever. Sleep is nice. Draco drew in a breath. Sounding distinctly pleased with himself, he turned his focus. Okay. Blaze, take him to the infirmary. Blaze put a hand on Dazai's shoulder. I was already planning on doing that, obviously. What? Dazai blinked, shooting up too quickly and immediately wavering with a wash of dizziness. The obnoxious little weasel smirked. Get a move on. Madame Pomfrey has potions for this sort of thing, you know. You'll be better by dinner so we can get back to practicing spells. I want to see if you've actually improved over the break. I have, he whined, flopping further down the chair and glaring half-heartedly in Draco's general direction. Dazai was also fairly sure that potions wouldn't work on him. At the very least, he didn't want to test that theory with an audience. Which is why you should let me sleep in. Yeah. Blaze hummed. He grabbed Dazai's arm and hauled him to his feet. When Dazai stumbled to correct his blurring vision, a hand caught on his shoulder to keep him upright. Once the world had stopped spinning, Dazai grumbled. She's just going to tell me to sleep it off, idiot boss. Come back when you're done coughing. Draco is boring too. You're all no good to me. I know. Even with most of the students back on school grounds now, the corridors were mostly empty. Judging by the weary expressions on his friends' faces, Dazai figured that the long ride to Hogwarts must have worn out most everybody else. Because of this, Blaze and Dazai only passed a handful of other students while they walked to the infirmary. It was nice, a final reprieve before classes started again, and the halls were as congested as always. Blaze really did look exhausted, though. Taking pity on him, Dazai briefly added, I've just been up to my usual tricks while you all were gone. Consider this, he coughed lightly. Karma, or something. Glancing between Blaze and the door, Dazai smiled sheepishly. He hesitated just shy of actually reaching the nurse's office. This might take a while. Blaze hummed. Don't make it sound like a question, Blaze intoned, pinching the bridge of his nose. If you want to ditch me to do something idiotic, just say so. Great. You still have to go to the infirmary, boss. The infirmary isn't down that hall, Dazai. Nope. He could feel the force of Blaze's exasperation all the way to the Gryffindor common rooms, discounting the 3 wrong turns he took getting there. The door to the Gryffindor common rooms was, just like the Slytherin entrance, activated by uttering a password. Unlike the blank wall in the dungeons, however, this one was guarded by a painting of a lady. She watched Dazai with blatantly suspicious eyes. He rapped the back of his knuckles against the stone wall beside the painting, fairly sure that touching the enchanted image would destroy it. The painted woman scoffed. "Can't you just let me in?" he asked, knocking a bit more forcefully this time. "Not without a password," the painting replied, sounding snappish. She leaned forward and cupped her pale face between her palms as if bored. "You're just going to stand out here and wait." Dazai raised a solitary brow. "Just call a Weasley out for me. You can do that, can't you?" "I suppose." She didn't make to move. Dazai bared his teeth in a hollow smile. Now, preferably, the painted lady offered a thin-lipped smile. Getting into the Gryffindor common rooms had been 10 times easier with the Weasleys parading him down the hall. It was a shame. With all the students back on school grounds, they couldn't own the halls any longer. Maybe once he announced his gang to the whole school. Dazai was just about to add another snapping remark to his request when the painting door swung outward. A pale, ginger-haired head poked out from behind it, looking around curiously. Dazai frowned. "Who are you?" "No thanks." He waved off the concern. "Is it banned, inviting Slytherins into your common room? Or just frowned upon?" "Is it banned?" Dazai repeated with a pout. "Well, not technically. Great. I'll just sneak on past you then." Without waiting for further affirmation, Dazai snaked through the barely open painting and into the Gryffindor common rooms. He brushed the prefect's sleeve as he passed. "Thanks, Percy. You're a real swell guy." Behind him, the elder Weasley made a sound as if he were utterly perplexed. He seemed to flounder for a second, gaping at the unexpected and unwarranted entrance. Dazai didn't care as he skipped across the Gryffindor common room and towards the bedrooms. He pushed through a swarm of Gryffindor students. Was the whole house loitering in the common rooms right now? He ducked around a few tired-looking Gryffindors and offered them a disarming smile. They blinked back, stupefied. All the eyes of Gryffindor were on them now, tracking the snake slithering across their lion's den. Mostly, Dazai saw confusion there. Confusion and anger, maybe hate. Being a Slytherin certainly came with some negative implications. Hanging over Draco's shoulders like a lazy cat all the time probably wasn't helping Dazai to seem approachable either. An angry murmur rolled through the crowd. Dazai felt his spine tense up in preparation for an attack, and he forced his skip to a slow, halting step. He caught Neville's eye in the crowd, and the boy offered a reassuring smile. Coming to a stop, Dazai beamed and whirled on his heels to face the prefect once again. He rocked in place. "What?" Percy raced up to him, still looking decently jarred. "Please don't just invite yourself in." The mafioso rolled his eyes. "You're no fun." Under his breath, Percy mumbled, "I can see why the twins like you so much." Dazai grinned. Seeming to realize that he'd been overheard, Percy straightened up self-consciously. He cleared his throat. "That is to say, you seem to be quite the free spirit. You would have made a good Gryffindor with that nerve and daring." Percy looked around to the myriad of faces watching, then made a brief placating gesture with both hands. It didn't seem to do much to assuage the crowd. House loyalties would always be too strong for something like that. "I suppose I can't convince you to wait for me to fetch Ron, can I?" "Nope," Dazai hummed, popping the P loudly. "I'm very determined. Just another of my Gryffindor traits." It took a moment, but Percy seemed to finally manage shaking the perplexed, vaguely annoyed look from his face. He turned to face the growing crowd around them. "He's fine, everyone. Dazai is just a friend of Ron's. I'm sure he won't be causing any trouble." Percy gave Dazai a pointed look, recalling Neville's broken remembrall. Another wave of jeers rose up from the crowd. Pasting on an empty smile, Dazai focused his attention back on Percy, who was quickly beginning to look overwhelmed. "I'll be quick. Please." With a nod and thanks, Dazai spun around and hurried to the bedrooms. A wave of protests followed after him, but Percy's presence seemed to hold them at bay. Once he reached the door, Dazai quickly snapped it closed behind him and shut his eyes. He leaned against it and took a deep breath. All those people surrounding him. Dazai's stomach clenched painfully. He blinked his eyes open. Ron's head was poked out from behind the curtains of his bed, looking confused. The ginger's expression was taut. I thought we were meeting in the hall. Dazai took a moment to catch his breath. We were. But I wanted to see. He coughed a little and looked around to ensure that they were alone. I wanted to see the egg myself. Has it hatched yet? Ron stared at him for a minute before relenting. He waved Dazai forward. Grinning broadly, the mafioso strode forward, then crawled onto Ron's bed. He fixed the curtains back into place behind him. In the middle of the bed, the black dragon's egg rocked back and forth. It didn't seem any closer to hatching than it had been during Christmas. Dazai needed to look over some of the books in the library, before he could say for certain, though. No, Ron said with a frustrated sigh. Have you been keeping it on the fire? The boy shot him a glare. When I can. It's not exactly easy to sneak a dragon egg around the common rooms. Not now that everyone is back, at least. Dazai shrugged, leaning in to inspect the egg while being careful not to touch it. I don't see why you can't hatch the dragon, Ron continued in a grumble. This is your idiotic plan, after all. Because, Dazai said, it's always freezing in the Slytherin common rooms. I don't think anyone could hatch a dragon in those conditions, not to mention that he would probably kill it with a single touch. But Ron didn't really need to know that. And until Dazai got a read on Quirrell's reaction, the egg was staying put here. Ron barked. No. I just don't know about getting involved in your schemes. You love it. And don't worry so much about getting in trouble. I have everything under control. Ron had his hands wrapped around the egg when he seemed to realize, wait, did you just come in through the front door? Ron glared. I said that while possibly facing down a wild beast. It didn't mean anything. It did. Anyway, I'm pretty sure everyone already know we hang out. Suddenly, Ron socked him in the arm. It was more of a tap than anything else. Feigning hurt, Dazai puckered his lower lip. You're an idiot. Ron grumbled. Not unkindly. The egg wavered in agreement. Seeming to remember their primary objective, Ron reached for a stack of blank papers on his bedside table. Usually, yeah. With the air a little less tense, Ron deflated into his bed. He withdrew his wand from somewhere, then offered Dazai a brief glance. Shame you're horrid at magic. I'm going to tire myself out casting Incendio all day. Dazai hopped off the bed and onto his feet. He followed the wand's movements. The fire-making spell? The twins can probably help with that. Probably, Ron hummed. He flicked his wand. Incendio. A small yellow blaze began eating up the papers slowly. The kindling crackled and snapped. Ron set the egg down over the flames. The good ones. He quickly said goodbye to Ron with a promise to check back up on the egg's progress throughout the week. Though now that the rest of Gryffindor definitely knew about their friendship, Dazai could maybe take a slightly different approach than breaking into their common room. Not that it mattered much. He had more important things to worry about for now, namely this so-called Philosopher's Stone. If there was ever something that Dazai wasn't supposed to know about, he was obviously going to investigate it with all of his cold, dead heart, whether it was something Quirrell had or something Quirrell wanted. Well, Dazai wanted it too. If only so Quirrell wouldn't have it, and with Mori finally giving him an objective, collect the Philosopher's Stone. Dazai gave a friendly wave to Percy as he passed back through the common room. The prefect's hand rose slightly to wave back, though the look he wore was slightly dumbfounded. Around Percy, the dozen or so faces of Gryffindor students watched with equal bemusement. Dazai was pleased to see that it was mostly the older students who looked upset. The first-year faces that he recognized seemed almost resigned to this level of chaos from Dazai. Enough to not chase him out with a pitchfork and flame, at least. Thanks for your hospitality or whatever. Dazai hummed, treading around a group of older students cautiously. Even though you weren't nice at all. A ripple of offended and perplexed mumblings ran through the crowd. Dazai shook off their quiet conversations. He'd win them over eventually. Without looking back, Dazai gave a final, wordless goodbye. His hands were faced out to push open the exit when a sudden voice caught his attention. Dazai halted. Where do you think you're going without saying hello first? Hermione's smile was wide and honest where she stood just outside a second dorm room. Hermione, he greeted, spinning on his heels to face her as she approached. It's a shame you went home over break. No one here would sit in the library and pore over research with me. She laughed. I missed you too. From the crowd, Dazai noticed some of the first-year Gryffindor students nodded in vague agreement. Odd, considering he'd barely interacted with anyone here. Probably more nonsense from Ron and Hermione about him being nice and lonely. Something Dazai was still steadfastly pretending never happened. Percy watched them with an odd expression. Dazai opened his mouth to explain that he would leave anyway when he was suddenly interrupted. Actually, the prefect cut in, it's about dinner time. I'm afraid you'll have to continue this conversation later, as I can't leave a non-Gryffindor student unattended in our common rooms. Dazai, he said seriously, turning his full attention to the Slytherin. I can walk you to the infirmary if you need. Dazai waved him off. I can manage. Thanks. He blinked at Hermione, smiling slightly at the pressed look on her face. Don't look like that. Anyway, Blaise will yell at me if I don't show up for dinner. He's like an overprotective dog sometimes. Whether Hermione was convinced or not went entirely ignored. It was best not to push his presence in the Gryffindor rooms before Dazai really had time to cement them as his subordinates. For now, he merely smiled pleasantly. The mafioso pushed the door open. Before I go, Dazai said, foot hanging out the door. Hermione, there's a topic I need to look into. I need your expertise in library navigation to find it. Care to lend a hand? The tension melted off of her face, immediately becoming replaced by fond excitement. Always. Great! He snapped his fingers. I'll see you later then, Hermione. Dazai hopped out of the open painting with a final nod to Percy, who was staring at the pair with something like befuddlement. Hermione's response was muffled beneath layers of Gryffindor murmurings. Dazai paid it no mind. He was already skipping down the hall towards a shortcut the twins had shown him. Even though the egg was no closer to hatching, it seemed, catching up with Ron and Hermione was great progress. Dazai was sure that having Hermione at his side to wade through textbooks would make finding relevant books on dragon identification much easier. Not only that, but he may finally locate a book on this Philosopher's Stone thing. Just as Snape had mentioned, it was near impossible for a student like himself to learn about it. But Hermione spent more time than he did at the library. Maybe she would have better luck than he'd been having. At the very least, searching together might be less boring than digging through dusty old books alone. 39 Bluff. Now that the second semester has begun, history professor Binns was saying, it is time to start preparing for your final exams. I expect all of you will be completing your essays on time in order to best prepare yourselves. Dazai slunk further down into his seat until only his hair was poking over the table. He blinked. Draco was staring down at his scroll, writing a note down intermittently. Dazai could just barely make out the slight quirk of amusement on the boy's lips as he spoke under his breath. He's not. He probably doesn't even realize I'm in his class. Draco's quill scratched something down in clean, exact cursive. He whispered, he was staring straight at you when he said that. All the professors agree that you're going to fail every final exam. Oh? Are you all close friends now? Dazai asked quietly. I bet Professor Quirrell didn't say that. You hate Professor Quirrell. That's true, but he likes me. Ahem. Dazai and Draco both looked up. Professor Binns glared them down from the front of the classroom. Draco looked away sheepishly. Dazai waved a hand coolly. Not looking at all contented, the ghostly history professor nodded. He continued, as I was saying, class, boring. Dazai melted back into the hard wooden desk chair. A small glance to Draco showed that the other snake was still silently taking notes. I don't have to write the essays to know that I'm not going to pass any of my finals. He whispered after Bin's eyes finally left their corner of the classroom to lecture someone else. Aren't they mostly practical exams? Dako didn't look up. He was silent for a moment. You've been improving, Dazai hummed. That much was true. In their latest loyalty club meetings since winter break concluded, he had managed to cast a few of the basic Year 1 spells successfully and without getting too sick. But the handful of spells he could manage were still too few, and even then, he could just barely manage them. Not that much, boss. Draco nodded in apparent agreement. Well, that's true. I guess you'll just have to repeat first year over again. Ugh, Dazai whined, running a hand over his face. Don't even say that. I'll just drop out. Don't worry, we'll keep training you even if you are our underclassman, Draco said with a flick of his quill. Draco raised a brow. His quill stalled over the paper, hovering like a dragonfly unsure where to rest. Should I be concerned that you suddenly want to learn a fire-making spell? Yes, Blaze interrupted. You should be. I am. Aw, you don't trust me? You aren't helping your case at all. Dazai stuck his tongue out. Blaze's lip twitched upwards. He refocused their conversation with a hushed whisper. Dazai, at least pretend to pay attention in this class. The History of Magic final isn't a practical exam. I've already read the book, he replied shortly. His second-in-command opened his mouth to respond, but Professor Binns spoke first. Simply reading the book will not help you retain all the necessary information, Mr. Dazai. The ghost professor intoned with a peeved tilt to his lips. I would advise you to start doing your assignments if you do not wish to fail my class. Now enough whispering amongst yourselves, you three. That's 5 points each from Slytherin for talking during lecture. Sorry, sir. Blaze deadpanned at the same time Draco grumbled. Yes, sir. As I was saying, Binns continued to the class, final exams will commence during the first full week of May. I expect all of you to stay on top of your studies and to aim for top marks on the exam. Until then, don't forget to read Chapter 13 in your textbooks. Your 5-page essay on Emmerich the Evil is due tomorrow, don't forget. With a final glance to Dazai's chatty Slytherin trio, the professor concluded, Class is dismissed. Suddenly, there was a clatter of chairs and books as the class began to break apart. Chatter spread out among the students. Dazai groaned, stretching out over the chair as he sat back up. How boring. I should take a nap, he said, slinging his book bag over his shoulder. Draco gave him an unimpressed glance. As they left the classroom, the gang pointedly ignored Professor Binns' glaring eyes. Dazai wasn't concerned. He was certain that he would pass the history final if he actually tried. It was the class itself that was a total waste of Dazai's time. The material itself? Beyond interesting, especially considering how closely guarded the information was outside of the magical community. But having to wade through the same dry information over and over again was exhausting and tedious. Often. Otherwise they'll start to bite. Dazai smirked. My boss is great, even if he is always comparing me to a pet. You're welcome, Draco replied, confident as ever. We're going to have to practice in the common rooms, though. It's too cold to linger outside. Dazai frowned, already disliking the idea of practicing where all the other Slytherins could just walk in on them. He opened his mouth to speak, but Pansy was arguing before he could. He's just going to get sick again. Pansy interrupted. Her face was painted over with a deep scowl. Honestly, Draco, I don't know why you even bother with him. Dazai mutely wondered if explaining that he hadn't thrown up doing magic in weeks would help his character much. Probably not. After all, he'd given himself a cold in part from practicing so much over break. That wasn't exactly normal wizard behavior. Draco was in the process of explaining himself when Dazai saw him. Quirrell. The Dada professor approached them from the end of the hall, brushing through students like a salmon upstream. Professor Quirrell had his eyes locked on Dazai, clearly searching him out. It sent an odd shiver down Dazai's spine. There was something unusual in the professor's eyes that put him totally on edge. Something like I know I had a dragon egg was burning there. Dazai steeled himself as Quirrell finally came within speaking distance. Anticipating Quirrell's greeting, Dazai cut Draco off mid-rant to call out, Professor Quirrell, didn't your class just end a minute ago? If you wanted to chat, you didn't have to sprint all the way down here to see me. Draco's mouth snapped shut as he abruptly realized that their conversation had an observer. Both Blaze and Pansy quieted down as well. They turned their full attention onto Quirrell, who was looking a little surprised at having been called out. Mr. Dazai, that's not... Quirrell stammered, then trailed off. I need to speak with you a moment. About our lessons. Dazai already knew what they had to talk about, and it wasn't his remedial lessons. Beside him, the rest of the Loyalty Club shared a few blank looks. I was just thinking the same thing, sir, Dazai replied, smiling sedately. Though he noticed Blaze shooting him a subvert glance, Dazai's full attention was on Quirrell now, entitled as ever. Dazai should probably fill the other boy in on his suspicions about Quirrell before he got himself hurt running his mouth. Sorry, boss, Dazai said, not turning to face Draco while he spoke. Some other time, I guess. Maybe Professor Quirrell can show me the basics while we chat. Draco, for a moment, looked as though he might protest again. A hand on his shoulder, courtesy of Blaze, stopped him short. Blaze shook his head. Pansy scoffed in clear agreement. I'd rather he not light me on fire. Grinning Blaze's way, Dazai could feel his appreciation for his loyal second-in-command grow tenfold. After having filled Blaze in on the scope of his investigation, the Slytherin still firmly believed that Dazai knew what he was doing. It was a good feeling, and very promising for a gang leader to be. Quirrell was being too brazen, approaching him like this, which meant they really would just be talking. Dazai didn't think Quirrell would blow his deep cover in Hogwarts just to kill him over a dragon's egg. So, talking. A mutual interrogation between Mafia members. Dazai could work with that, kind of. After a moment, his friends walked back down the hall they had come from. Only Blaze looked back over his shoulder as they passed. Dazai waved a cheery goodbye. Once they were out of view, however, Dazai flipped back to Quirrell. Let's talk in my office, Dazai agreed. As they walked through the halls, Dazai and Quirrell drew a number of curious student eyes. Dazai tried not to let the attention bother him too much. He had bigger things to think about, but the stare still made his skin itch. Notably that Quirrell had obviously sought him out. That could only really mean one thing, but Dazai was woefully unprepared to have this conversation. He had known practically that it was only a matter of time before his Dada professor cornered him about the missing dragon's egg. But despite all Dazai's searching, his knowledge on this philosopher's stone and dragon were still too limited for him to feel comfortable leveraging his position. He couldn't fish for information too much without giving away that he was just vaguely stumbling into this investigation, with Hermione too busy to help him scour the library, and Quirrell's motivations still a mystery. The most Dazai could do was to act innocent, or he could bluff like it was going out of style, which seemed like a much more Dazai plan to recklessly enact. He just barely caught Fred's eye in the crowd of students wandering Hogwarts halls. Just a flash of ginger hair among the crowd, really. It was no surprise that once Dazai was looking, he easily found George as well. The twins looked between him and Quirrell with wide eyes and parted mouths. Once their eyes met, the pair seemed to reach an unspoken agreement, and they began hurriedly walking in Quirrell's direction. Dazai shook his head minutely. I've got it handled. Stay out of this. Fred and George halted in their steps immediately, faces morphing into confusion. Unfortunately, Dazai didn't have time to entertain their misguided concern. He hurried to follow Professor Quirrell before the man noticed he was lagging behind. The twins vanished into the mass of students. Then the students vanished too. Quirrell shut the office door behind Dazai as the boy entered. The air felt tense, more tense than it had been during their regular lessons. Dazai refused to let it bother him. He may not have had all of the cards in his hand, but that wasn't going to undermine his experience with interrogations. When Professor Quirrell turned from the door, his face was grim, serious, intrigued, maybe? In an odd sort of way, Dazai thought that was probably the case. Quirrell cut to the chase. Dazai wouldn't have expected anything less from a supposed mafia member. There was no class or flair for dramatic among these lower grunts. Something has gone missing from my office. There it is. I can't help but wonder, seeing as you were wandering near my office that night, Quirrell continued, expressions suddenly impossible to read. If you might know something about that, Dazai hummed, feigning thoughtfulness. He paused for a moment, as if deeply considering the man's concerns. Then, in a voice like pure innocence, he asked, Will you show me Incendio, Professor? Quirrell blinked once, looking caught off guard. Then, strangely, his face morphed into thick irritation. The emotion didn't fit quite right on the normally anxious professor's face, but the professor collected himself immediately, wiping the expression off his face without a word. Quirrell withdrew his wand from his cloak and gave it a swish. With a single hushed incantation, the candle on his desk burst to life. The flame flickered, tireless and small. As to my question, and now, Quirrell continued. He tried to mask it, but Dazai could still hear the frustration building in his voice. A certain item was taken that night. It is quite important. Dazai closed his eyes as Quirrell spoke, feeling for how the man's magic had behaved almost instinctively. He kept most of his attention on the main threat, Quirrell, but still allowed himself the simple curiosity. Incendio had been a snap of energy in the air. Dazai's brows pinched together as he tried to parse out the sensation. It can't be that important, he said after a moment. Dazai retrieved his wand and rolled it through his fingers thoughtfully. If you're only asking me about it now, sir. Quirrell paused. He watched as Dazai raised his wand and gave it a swish identical to Quirrell's had been moments before. Something on the desk began to smoke, but no flame appeared. Dazai huffed. Try again, Dazai did. The movement of his wand arm was mostly automatic. So was the surge of pain under his skull. I'm only curious, Dazai hummed, frowning at the puff of smoke curling away into nothing. That you only bring this up now if you're so worried about it. He waved his wand. If it were me, I wouldn't hesitate to take back what was mine. Out of the corner of his eye, Dazai saw that Quirrell hadn't expected to have the conversation flipped on him, nor the loose threat lingering in the aftermath. He had startled back a step at the blatant nature of his student's inquiry. Whatever curiosity had sparked the man's interest in Dazai, it hadn't been his intellect apparently. Quirrell opened his mouth to continue, but Dazai didn't let him. Say, Professor Quirrell, Dazai smiled demurely, his voice all kinds of practiced innocence. He waved his wand in a tight circle and held back a wince at the way his stomach rolled in response. How come the other professors hate you so much? The room went silent. He could probably hear that annoying angel's skittering pause had the rat been present. Quirrell didn't speak for long enough that Dazai tilted his head back to see what sort of expression his professor was wearing. Blank. A totally blank face stared down at him. A grin worked its way onto Dazai's lips. This was going to be fun. Isn't it more correct to say that you were at a bit of a crossroads? Dazai asked, smug. You can't silence me about the dragon's egg, Quirrell flinched, because I could just as easily report to the staff about you threatening me. Telling anyone that I had a dragon egg would just lead to me saying who I got it from. But you can't just let me go either, can you? Because Dumbledore will have to take action against you if a student makes any sort of accusation. You haven't finished what you came to Hogwarts to do, so you can't risk it all now getting back at me. That was technically a guess, but judging by the look on Quirrell's face, it had worked. The man looked startled, beyond caught off guard. Dazai took a moment to enjoy that expression. It was a real shame that Dazai had absolutely no context for the nonsense he was spewing aside from a vague hunch and Snape's prickly overprotectiveness. With any luck, Quirrell would let something slip. Dazai would kill for an explanation as to why his least favorite professor was touting around highly illegal dragon contraband. That might help piece a few things together. He couldn't risk being too demanding, though. For much the same reason Quirrell wouldn't break his cover in Hogwarts, Dazai wouldn't break his. I'm curious why you waited this long to talk, though. Were you waiting to see if I would tell the headmaster? I'm offended you think so little of me, sir. Or were you feeling me out? Reprising what you think I'm capable of. There was no way Quirrell knew Dazai was Mafia, after all. Clasping his hands behind his back, Dazai smiled serenely at the blank face Quirrell wore. You could always just kill me, of course, Dazai continued with a bounce. But your position is quite a bit more precarious than mine. I probably wouldn't risk it if I were you. If you take me out, he didn't say, that's game over for you. After all, it's one thing to take the fall for something. It's another thing entirely to let your organization fall with you. The Mafia was no different wherever you were. The fact that Quirrell had done nothing for days only to finally make this rather lackluster move proved it. Quirrell would make a poor chess player. You are quite a clever child, aren't you? Dazai gave his wand another flick, feigning disinterest as he chanted a subdued Incendio. For Quirrell's spell it had felt like a snap, so Dazai made his magic feel like snapping too. Ever so slightly, the tiniest of flames spurred to life over one of Quirrell's quills, burst forth from the tip of Dazai's wand. The feather quickly caught ablaze as the fire hungrily searched for kindling. Dazai titled his head back and grinned triumphantly. A nasty wave of nausea knocked Dazai back a step until he was forced to lean against a desk. His sudden instability must have shaken Quirrell from his thoughts. The man smiled, anxious. A bit mistaken, perhaps, but clever nonetheless. Quirrell moved across the room. Once he was close enough that Dazai could feel the man's breath, he looped an arm under Dazai's shoulder, hoisting him upright. Now, if you'll just return the egg to me. Dazai huffed and tried to force himself out of Quirrell's grip. In response, the professor only tightened his hold. Dazai ignored how rough his heartbeat had gotten. Tough luck, he said, voice hollow. I don't have it. Quirrell frowned. Almost hesitantly, he released his hold on his student. The second Dazai was free. He clattered a few feet away from Quirrell. The residual press of arms around him stung. What? Who does? Dazai shrugged, but now he felt cold. The feeling of Quirrell's touch lingered. No one who's going to rat you out. Quirrell must have already reasoned that Ron was in possession of the egg. They hadn't tried to hide that fact. What do you want a dragon for anyway, sir? If it was so important, Quirrell wouldn't have risked bringing it to Hogwarts, where he could be easily noticed. It was also interesting that, as the twins had mentioned offhand, the egg hadn't been kept over a flame. Which meant, "You weren't trying to hatch it," Dazai said. "You going to give the egg to someone?" Dazai racked his brain but couldn't think of any staff or students who would accept a gift like that. Maybe the egg was a job for this wizard mafia? Although no one else on campus had struck Dazai as having the same menacing way about them as Quirrell did. A twitch of Quirrell's eye gave the man away. Dazai realized it all at once. The egg was in exchange for information. What was it that Snape had asked during his forest meeting with Quirrell? Something about getting past one of Hagrid's beasts? Dazai's eyes narrowed as he rapidly tried to piece together the mystery before him. An idea tickled the back of Dazai's mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had research to do, a lot of it, and he was already pushing his luck with this half-hearted interrogation. It was a miracle that he hadn't outright misjudged anything yet with his soft bluffs. Quirrell's reactions had all proven that Dazai's hunches were correct. The man was a threat who had snuck into Hogwarts for some nefarious reason, which only meant one thing. Whatever organization Quirrell belonged to wanted something that could only be found at Hogwarts. Whatever you're looking for at Hogwarts, if it's a productive history lesson, I'm afraid you've come to the wrong school. Professor Binns is right awful. Dazai offered a practiced, if numb, smiled. He swung his bag over his shoulder and turned on his heel to leave. He glanced over his shoulder, just to see what sort of face Quirrell would wear. I've heard talk of a philosopher's stone recently. Maybe something to do with that? Huge bluff. Dazai should probably learn when to hold his tongue. But something changed in Quirrell's expression. Like a flip had been switched, that nervous demeanor withered away to dust, blank eyes and a reappraising stare. Quirrell stared down at him like he was looking at someone totally new. Maury looked at him like that. Sometimes, too. So Dazai's suspicions were correct. Whatever this philosopher's stone thing was, Quirrell had infiltrated Hogwarts to get his hands on it, probably at the command of whatever wizard mafia he was a member of. Quirrell needed to bribe the other professors to get information about it, because they were all hiding it from him. Or maybe not, Dazai said flippantly. He waved, then walked out the door. I'll see you in class, Professor. This would end on Dazai's terms. The fire on Quirrell's desk devoured a mess of essays until nothing but ashes remained. It seems, Quirrell said just as Dazai was leaving, we both have secrets worth keeping. Then, Dazai had the information. Now what? Once the door shut behind him, Dazai fell back against the wall, shivering. His breathing was ragged, and the echo of Quirrell's touch lingered still. Dazai was prepared for an interrogation, for backing Quirrell into a corner, for bluffing wildly on the fly. He hadn't expected to be grabbed. Dazai pushed himself off of the wall, thinking how it was best not to linger. Instead of hurrying off towards the Great Hall, where Draco and company would be soon, he turned off in the direction of the Slytherin chambers. He had time. Plenty of time to grab his knife and cut open his arm a little bit. That would calm him down. Or, Dazai. He startled, jerking back a step involuntarily. Fred and George hurried across the hall straight at Dazai. Their faces were scrunched up and their mouths were pressed shut. When they were close enough to touch him, neither twin hesitated to wrap their arms around his shoulders. They quickly guided him down the hall further from Quirrell's office. They maneuvered him into one of their secret passageways, the long corridor that Dazai often used to get to the Dada classroom when he was alone. The wall shut behind them, blocking off the outside world completely. The Weasley twins whirled on him immediately. Fred fussed over Dazai's face, inspecting his blank expression with something like worry. Beside him, George had crouched down to meet Dazai eye to eye. Are you okay? George asked, voice hushed and backed in concern. Fred nodded fervently. We saw Quirrell taking you somewhere and got worried. It took a moment for Dazai to collect himself. All of their fretting must have shaken a weight loose in Dazai's mind, because he found it suddenly much easier to slip his mask back into place. He smiled, hoping it wasn't too shaken around the edges. I'm fine. He just wanted to talk. Not today, they argued. The twins shared one of their looks. Then, almost carefully, George said, "He gives off a dangerous vibe to you, right? A professor making you feel unsafe is important, Snakey. You aren't getting what I'm saying." Fred sighed. He straightened up beside his brother. "Let us have this. As your self-appointed big brothers, we have an obligation to worry about you, especially when a suspected criminal who we stole contraband from is trying to isolate you. That's..." Dazai stared, feeling numb. "Idiotic." "Maybe." They smiled. "Do you feel better?" He was feeling better. A little. And the pressure of the twins on his shoulders hadn't stung at all. "Yes," he grumbled. They beamed. "Great. Now what was it you and Professor Squirrel were talking about in there?" 40 pranks and chaos. Dazai couldn't hold the egg without killing the dragon inside. This made moving it exceptionally difficult. But it couldn't stay with Ron. No. There was no saying whether Quirrell would make some kind of play to get the egg back, keeping it with Dazai's only. Known accomplices would just leave it open for the taking. When it came to the dragon, Ron, Fred, and George were all made. Dazai had a few ideas about where he could put the egg to, keep it out of Quirrell's prying hands, but, well, hiding it wasn't a problem. Moving it was. Fred and George watched with mute amusement as Dazai tried to puzzle this particular problem out. "Just," Fred said, "pick it up and walk it over to the Slytherin common rooms?" Ron squinted up at him from the bed. He hovered over the egg. "Or leave it here, I'm keeping an eye on Eggy just fine." Dazai waved off the concerns. "When did you get so attached, Ron? I thought you wanted. Nothing to do with this?" Ron shuffled self-consciously on the bed. Dazai continued. "Anyway, it'll be safer with Blaze for now." "Blaze?" Ron squeaked. The twins also perked up in something like interest, though they were decidedly less aghast than their younger brother. "A Slytherin knows about this." "Too," Dazai hummed, "including me. You know what I mean." He smirked. "I do, but he's trustworthy. Promise." Ron looked like he wanted to argue further, but decided against it. Dazai didn't push the issue further. He turned his gaze back to the egg. "I'll make him give it back once we're in the clear. Don't worry so much." He rubbed at his chin, thoughtful. Before Ron could offer any more protest, Dazai asked, "I don't suppose any of you would be willing to let Blaze in here, in the Gryffindor common room?" Fred asked, sharing a look with his twin. George looked apologetic. "I think you're the exception to that rule, Snakey, and only just." Barely, by the looks of things, that much was true. Even with both of the Weasley twins parading him through the front. Door, angry mummers and glares acted as his reception. Luckily, they had the entire bedroom to themselves. Dazai wasn't keen on having this particular conversation with a Gryffindor audience. Dazai shook the thought from his mind. "Well, one of you is going to have to go the Slytherin rooms then." Ron's brows pinched together. "And you can't do this?" "Nope," Dazai said cheerfully. "Quirrell is keeping a close eye on me, obviously. He's more likely to let one of you slip past." That was technically true. It was also technically a lie, but that was neither here nor there. Dazai knew it was believable when the twins began to nod along. Earlier, it had been somewhat embarrassing to have them fussing over him. But now Dazai found himself somewhat reassured. He appreciated their loyalty to his welfare. They made acceptable subordinates. The twins stood at his shoulders like protective guard dogs. Ron still didn't look convinced. "Trust me," Dazai said. "I'll walk you down there and everything. Just hold on to the egg until I can convince Blaze to take it." "Convince him?" Ron squawked. "Shouldn't he already know what he's getting into?" "I haven't told him yet, since this is sort of a last-minute plan. I'm sure everything will work out, though. Blaze is flexible like that." Ron gave him a drawn-out look that Dazai pointedly ignored. "He'll love it." Dazai tried again. "What the hell?" Blaze said. Dazai grinned. "It's the dragon's egg I told you about. The one we stole while you and the others were off at Draco's boring holiday party. I remember." He stared from Dazai to the egg to the Gryffindors Dazai had invited over, then back again. "They can't come in here." "Not that you could stop me if I wanted that, but okay." Dazai said, smiling pleasantly. Dazai. And his 3 pet Weasleys stood bunched together just outside the entrance to the Slytherin common room. Blaise, leaned against the stone wall, seemed to exude exhaustion at the whole scenario. Behind him, Dazai heard Ron scoff, or maybe growl. It was sort of difficult to tell, what with these house rivalries being so feral and all. Can you just hold on to it for a few days, or weeks, maybe months? I haven't decided yet. Blaise's eye twitched. Look, he tried again. Hatching a dragon egg is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Ron made a noise. This one was definitely a scoff, because it's illegal. Exactly, Dazai cheered. Blaise made a face that was altogether too difficult to parse out. He stared down at the egg. It was clutched in Ron's hands and smothered with a long red and gold scarf. Were any observers to pass by, Ron could easily hide the dragon's egg under his scarf or within his cloak. What kind of dragon is that? Blaise asked after a moment. No clue, Ron said. Dazai glanced over to the red head, not having expected him to answer a Slytherin's question so amiably. I've been too busy to look, and no one but me here knows how to do basic research, so that rules these idiots out. Blaise looked somewhat appeased by that, for whatever reason. Over Dazai's shoulders, the twins chuckled. They had all been doing their parts, he supposed, whether that was heating or hiding the egg. Dazai really did have some good subordinates on his side. Dazai discarded that thought before it could get too sentimental. He turned to Blaise, serious. Quirrell might come looking for it, but he only knows that I've involved some Gryffindors. It will be safest with you. Safest with me, Blaise repeated. His lids were at half-mast as he inspected Dazai's expression. The mafioso pasted on a too large, lopsided smile. Right. I should have known. The second I wasn't on campus to watch, you would run off and get into trouble. It was a given, really. So you want me to hold on to the illegal creature that you stole from Quirrell, who is a wizard mafia, yeah. A wizard mafia, Blaise finished. Dazai nodded enthusiastically. Behind him, Ron seemed to radiate uncertainty. Quite. Honestly, Dazai was proud that the boy hadn't started snapping at Blaise's heels yet like the rambunctious little mutt that he was. With Draco, it had only been seconds before they were going at each other with teeth bared. Although that conversation had ended in a very different light, hadn't it? Or maybe Blaise's deadpan stare was just too hard to get angry with. Whatever it was, the twins seemed more amused than anything. There was a pause, a long pause. Then finally Blaise relented with a sigh. All right, fine. He took the egg from Ron, who gave it up with only minimal resistance, in a quieter voice. Blaise muttered, Don't let your scheming get too out of hand. Take care of yourself first, boss. He and Dazai were leaned in close to one another. It felt too conspiratorial for such warm words. Hey, Slytherin! Both Blaise and Dazai flipped their attention to Ron, drawing apart immediately. The boys. Face flushed red, seeming to realize his own outburst only after it had sprung loose. Ron scowled falteringly. Take good care of Eggy or I'll hex you. Blaise frowned, then glanced to the egg tucked up against his cloak. He pointed at it in mute. Question. Oh, right, Dazai said, whirling back to his second-in-command. Ron got himself attached to it and named the stupid thing Eggy. Didn't you name your owl Featherbrain? Ron snorted. Traitor. Technically, I guess that did happen. Well, Blaise hummed after a moment, I guess every pet does need a name. Ron's eyes seemed to light up. But Eggy. It's a placeholder, Ron said defensively. Well, they were getting on nicer than Dazai had expected. Still, he cut them off before they could start conspiring against him. I have other things to take care of. Dazai interrupted, hand raised in mild protest. Now that I know you two won't kill each other, I think I'll take my leave. Oh, bye, Blaise said distractedly, his attention fully on the egg now. Ron shot Dazai a vaguely appalled look, his mouth hung open. Dazai ignored him. Just keep it over a flame. Ron has been using Incendio. It was only moderately infuriating the look of fond humor that rolled over Blaise's face at that. Dazai huffed at the expression there. It wasn't as if Dazai had wanted to learn Incendio, just to help Ron hatch the egg. He was a purely self-serving creature after all. Obviously, whatever. I'm leaving, he said shortly. Don't bother. Blaze took a step toward the doorway, still smiling very slightly. I'll go and put this over a flame. You Gryffindors should go back to your dorms before anyone else shows up. I can't be bothered with Draco's yelling today. Ron made an annoyed sound. Have fun, boss, Blaze said with a stiff wave. He muttered this week's password and vanished behind the gateway the moment it had opened for him. The stolen egg had safely disappeared to its Slytherin vault. Dazai let out a breath. The hallway was empty and silent, but knowing Dazai's rowdy subordinates, the quiet wouldn't last long. Boss? Ron and the twins echoed. Nope, not long at all. Though Ron appeared somewhat aghast, Fred and George looked utterly delighted. For no discernible reason, Dazai felt his face grow warm. He grinned to hide the odd flutter in his chest. Slytherin politics, Dazai explained with a lazy wave of his hand. I'm sure you'll hear about my Slytherin takeover eventually. You're what now? Never mind that, he said pointedly. I need to speak to Hagrid. Thanks for dropping the egg off for me, but I really need to be going now. Hagrid? The twins repeated. Why's that? Dazai made a vague hand-wavy gesture. I'm meddling, he explained. It's tangentially related to the egg. I'm certain that he'll have some information for me. They blinked. Fred smiled amicably. Do you know the way to Hagrid's hut? Did he? A brief image flashed in Dazai's mind of Ron and him traversing through the snow, in the dead of winter's night. Hagrid's hut had been something of a faraway beacon in the field, but they hadn't sought it out. It had been cold enough that the ice wind had stung his cheeks white and red, shaking the memory off like fallen snow. Dazai only shrugged. More, or less. Well then, the twins said together, we'll have to walk you there. Come on. Without waiting for confirmation, Fred and George began their march down the hall. Better follow them, mate, Ron said shortly. I've got to catch dinner, but those two won't. Drop something till they're done with it. Guess for today that something is you. He made an odd, soft face. Fred and George really care about you, you know? Dazai frowned. That fluttery warmth returned. They don't. They totally did. Ron merely huffed out a breath in response. He glanced to the Slytherin doorway, then back to Dazai. You better catch up to those two if you don't want to be late for dinner. See you around? Sure, Dazai said. He waved the boy off casually. Missing dinner wasn't really a concern for him, not when Blaze was too busy to pester him about eating. Missing the twins, on the other hand, was kind of a concern. Dazai wasn't certain he could navigate the school without them. Actually, he was pretty sure he would get lost straight away. After all, he usually had a guide for these types of excursions. Once Ron turned down the hall, Dazai looked over his shoulder to find where the twins had run off to. Fred and George were hovering just above his shoulders like two mother hens. Dazai jumped back a foot, startled by their close proximity. What? He asked a little breathlessly. Oh, nothing, George hummed, rocking back on his feet. Just making sure you're following, boss. Boss. Dazai blinked. Did the twins realize what they were saying? Of course not, Dazai thought. They were just teasing him. They didn't know that he had basically enlisted them into his gang, or that in the mafia calling someone boss held a lot of weight. But hearing them call him that so easily, making subordinates was really easy, wasn't it? Oi, George said. Earth to boss. Are you in there? Dazai shook himself from his stupor, immediately drawing a huge smile onto his face. You. No, I take the title of boss pretty seriously. The playfulness in his voice beguiled the seriousness hidden there. You'll have to pledge your loyalty if you want to call me that. Fred and George oohed. We're always loyal to a fellow prankster. Well. They did already run a successful heist together, and Dazai couldn't help but remember how even at the beginning of the school year, those two seemed to have his back. That in mind, welcome aboard then. He grinned. You're officially invited to my gang. Street name, pending. Huh. It was oddly rewarding to make these things official. Maybe he should do this more. Often, Ron would probably accept, right? Hermione, too. A gang. George said. "That's awesome. Your gang do a lot of mischief, Dan?" As they spoke, the twins began to guide Dazai down the hall. Though they passed a few other students, by now most everyone seemed to know about the unusual Slytherin Gryffindor friendship. They walked down a hall that was familiar only in the sense that every hall at Hogwarts was identical. "Well," Dazai hummed, "so far our only gang operation has been stealing an egg from Quirrell, so I guess." Overhead, the twins cheered. "Does that make us the most productive members of Gang Dazai?" "I think we should ask for a promotion, George." "Promotion request accepted," Dazai said, mock serious. A large grin was splitting his face. "As joint heads of the newly formed Pranks and Chaos Division, I expect great things out of you two." Fred and George applauded themselves over Dazai's head, and it was a good day to be boss. Dazai felt a shiver run up his spine. The wind was whipping through their little group, whistling and howling with the force of January weather. It wasn't snowing this time, but that didn't stop the gusting winds from turning Dazai's bones to ice. The pumpkins growing around them had accumulated a thick layer of frost at some point. Another heavy draft had him retreating into his cloak with a full-body shudder. Lingering just above him, Fred and George made a worried sound. They shuffled a step, closer to Dazai, so that they were blocking some of the wind against him. Dazai hid a pleased smile under his scarf at their fawning. Shooting their newly official boss a brief look, the twins reached out to knock on the massive wooden door to Hagrid's hut. "Oh, Hagrid, please let us in. We have a cold-blooded snake out here who needs to warm up." Dazai huffed into his scarf. A smoky plume of white breath billowed out from under the green cloth. He waited in silence, a quiet part of his brain, growing louder with each new gust of winter wind started begging for Hagrid to open the door. Maybe Dazai was a snake. Warming up by a burning fireplace was about the only thing on his mind. He thought he might freeze in place. Just when Dazai was about to suggest picking the lock and helping themselves in, a loud thud stopped him short. Thud, thud, the banging, swaying gait of someone large moving around inside the cabin. Thud. Thud. Dazai shivered against the twins' shoulders, frowning in anticipation. Thud. There was a loud bang followed by the door swinging open. The hinges creaked. Dazai stood to attention. His suddenly straight posture startled a sideways glance from the twins. The door slammed against the hut's wall with a gust of wind. The man standing on the other side of the door towered over them by at least 4 heads. Hagrid's face was approximately 2/3 scruffy beard and 1/3 puppy dog eyes. An animal pelt hung over his shoulders. "Not often I get visitors out here," Hagrid said. Dazai immediately recognized the man's booming voice from his first day at Hogwarts onboarding the train. "What can I do for you, lot?" The twins pointed their thumbs in Dazai's direction, grinning. "Can we talk inside before this one turns to ice?" Dazai tried to grin. It came out a bit more shivering than he had intended. Hagrid blinked down at them. Any curiosity tucked below that thick, scruffy beard melted away and was replaced by weary concern. He took a stumbling step to the side, then gestured, a meaty paw to motion the boys in. Hurry in. Too cold to be out standin' round out. Here, Dazai hesitated to comply, but Fred and George urged him inside. The mafioso didn't fight it. As he was guided through the door and abruptly pushed into a huge, scruffy sofa, there was, in fact, a roaring blaze lit in the fireplace. Dazai melted into it immediately. There must have been a contented look on his face, because the twins snickered as they sat down beside him. "Evening, Hagrid." "Evening, lads," the groundskeeper said. He glanced between them, then squeezed himself into the plush chair across from them. "Can't say I'm not a little bit nervous to have the Weasley twins poppin' in for a visit." Fred and George shared a smirk. "No pranks or chaos today. Well, maybe a little." Dazai ran his tongue over his blue lips. They were ice-cold and chapped. Once he was sure he felt sufficiently unfrozen to speak without a quivering voice, the mafioso interrupted. "No. Chaos here, at least. Behave, you two." They offered only a fake-sounding whine in response. "Yes, B-boss." Dazai blinked his attention back to Hagrid, who was watching the proceedings with a certain amount of concerned intrigue. Right. Because Hagrid wasn't a teacher, The man likely had no idea who he was. Dazai supposed all the talk about him failing at magic wouldn't have spread. To the groundskeeper, most students would never even have to interact with the man. After all, Dazai thought to wave, but his fingers were still shaky from the cold. He kept them tucked into his cloak and gave a tight-lipped smile instead. I'm sorry, where are my manners? I'm Dazai, everyone's favorite Slytherin. Ah, Hagrid started. He reached out a hand to shake, then seemed to think better of it. The hand fell limp on his lap instead. Pleased to meet you. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, Hagrid, Rubeus Hagrid. Groundskeeper heir at Hogwarts, though you lot already. Knew that. Sure do, the twins said. Fred turned to his brother, grinning madly. You remember that prank we pulled with the pumpkins? First year, George reminisced. Charmed the vines to trip anyone who walked by. Good times. Dazai wasn't sure that Hagrid agreed with the twins, if the pressed look on his face was any indication. He took some pity on the groundskeeper. No pranks today, I'm afraid. We actually just have a few questions for you, sir. The twins sobered up beside him. A frown pulled at Hagrid's lips. Wouldn't you be better off asking one of your professors those? I just watch over the grounds and animals. If Quirrell thought Hagrid was the best source for information here, so did Dazai. At the very least, he appreciated the idea of stealing Quirrell's plan. He couldn't exactly say any of this. Aloud, however, Dazai smiled. You seem like a trustworthy guy, he said. So I'm just going to cut to the chase. What do? You know about a philosopher's stone here at Hogwarts? No use trying subterfuge. Quirrell's plan, as far as Dazai could tell, had been functionally the same with the addition of bribery. Now Dazai wasn't above bribery, but he had already told Ron that he could keep the dragon. Hagrid went stock still. His eyes widened to two black saucers, scrambling between Dazai and the twins with something like panicked searching. When he finally met Dazai's gaze, head-on, Hagrid's alarm was replaced by a carefully assessing look. His voice was gruff and low. Where'd you hear that word from? Philosopher's Stone? Dazai asked, quite enjoying the way Hagrid seemed to want to shush him around. Pretty exciting stuff. Rumor has it you know something about it. Students aren't supposed to know a boo-tat, yet here we are. Hagrid looked between the students once more. A bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. You forget about anything you know about the stone. That's between Professor Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel. Dazai kept his expression blank, but he mentally noted the unfamiliar name down for later. Something to investigate in the library later when he finally pegged down Hermione's schedule. She would know how to find the information he needed. After all, Hermione spent more time studying in the library than Dazai did. It's top secret that, Hagrid said roughly. Don't even know how you know about it, Bean. Here. Dazai hummed, rolling some ideas through his head. He couldn't just torture the information out of Hagrid, even if that was the Port Mafia's standard. Hogwarts played by different rules. Bribery clearly wasn't off the table, but Dazai didn't know Hagrid well enough to safely segue into, do you want this illegal dragon egg my friend stole from a professor? Dazai contemplated his options. Maybe he was getting overconfident, rushing in here and immediately announcing he knew about the stone. Or maybe he was still shaken up from his encounter with Quirrell. Aw, come on, Hagrid, Fred cut in. George nodded, enthusiastic. Don't you think if students aren't meant to know about the stone, then there must be a reason that we do? Hagrid looked flummoxed. An idea sprung to life in Dazai's mind. He pasted a grave frown onto his face and spoke in a somber tone. A professor told us about it. That was technically true. A professor? Hagrid's nose scrunched up. Now, who would do something like that? They'd like to remain anonymous. Dazai fibbed. I'm sure you understand. The risk they took telling you us. Though Hagrid nodded, Dazai didn't think he looked too convinced. He latched onto that lost expression. They said that you were about as trustworthy as they come. There's no one better to turn to about this than Hagrid, they said. You'll help us, right? Dumbledore is counting on us. Hagrid's beard twitched as he tried to smother the proud smile forming there. Dazai could see. The man's resolve was mostly shaken now. This was too easy. Quirrell was an idiot to think he would need the egg as a bribe. It looked, to Dazai, that just asking Hagrid was going to give him the answers he needed. It was a wonder Quirrell hadn't taken what he'd come looking for at Hogwarts ages ago. The twins must have spotted that weakness in Hagrid's expression as well, because they both jumped on it like a dog to a bone. You'd be a hero. Real stand-up guy, our Hagrid. Dazai glanced between them. Hagrid shook his head. Shouldn't be telling you all this. He looked away. Dumbledore. Would have told me if we was getting students to help now. Not when he knows the stone is in danger from another professor. The groundskeeper seemed to freeze in place. After a moment, he said, That's not true. He had all the professors and myself make the guards to protect the stone after all. Bingo. That was definitely what Quirrell had wanted from Hagrid. What sort of guards? George asked. Charms and locks and protections? Hagrid paled, as though he had only just realized what information he had let slip. He lowered his voice. Nothing. You didn't hear nothing from me about that. We just did, though, Dazai said, smiling blankly. We're supposed to know this stuff. I promise. Even if I did know, I ain't telling ya. Just know the stone is well protected, and no professor is going to take it for themselves. Not while it's here. Here? The twins echoed. Was it stolen before? Hagrid shuffled in his seat, looking abashed. Nearly. From Gringotts, he quietly admitted. Dazai frowned. A break-in at Gringotts did sound vaguely familiar. No point in bothering. Over that now, of course. Dazai booed, falling back into the sofa in a last-ditch effort to warm up. If he was reading this information correctly, then Dumbledore had trusted each of his professors with the knowledge of the stone. More than that, he had trusted each of them to protect it, like a series of trials with the stone at the end. Quirrell didn't know how to get past Hagrid's. As for the others, what's yours, sir? Hagrid blinked. What about me? You said you didn't know what guards the other professor provided for the headmaster. What guard did you offer? I can't tell you that. Hagrid boomed, nearly shooting to his feet. He took a calming breath. I'm sure your mystery professor will appreciate you looking into this, but trust me, the stone is safe, Dazai hummed. He glanced around the hut, eyes flicking over the various knickknacks and animal pelts. What's your deal, he asked thoughtfully. Animals? Are you the animal? Guy? I bet it's a beast. The twins commented in tandem. Is your guard a beast, sir? Dazai asked. Hagrid's entire frame tensed. It is. That's two. Predictable. Now I'm bored. This time, Hagrid did shoot to his feet. With his heavy build, the hut shook at the movement. He looked startled, almost afraid, at having let so much information slip to mere students. His massive frame was a towering threat, but somehow having the twins by his side kept Dazai's instinctive flinch at bay. That was good enough, Dazai supposed. A magical beast posed no threat to Dazai after all. He cleared his throat, then rose to his feet as well. Thanks for the chat, Hagrid. You're a huge help. Dumbledore will thank you once this whole ordeal is done. As an afterthought, he added, but you can't tell him we were here, of course. He's on high alert for suspicious activity, and with the other professor trying to steal the stone. The twins mimed zipping their lips shut. Fred tossed out the key. I wouldn't risk it, Dazai confirmed. Maybe just lay low until we've rooted out the problem. That dumbfounded look was back on Hagrid's face. Dazai didn't take the time to dwell on it. An idea was bubbling in the back of his mind. Something extraordinarily entertaining. Something incredibly idiotic. It was great. Dazai spun, on his feet with a goodbye somewhere on his lips. The twins said their own part, then they hurried to follow after Dazai into the winter air. It was cold, but Dazai barely registered it beyond the force of the plan taking shape in his head. So? Fred interrupted Dazai mid-thought. We know it's being guarded. What now? Dazai spared him a glance. Well, he said, Quirrell is going to try and steal it eventually. He clearly doesn't know what to expect from Hagrid's beast guard, so that will slow him down. George made a thoughtful sound. Should we tell a professor, like for real, not to pester them for information? Where's the fun in that? The twins shared a look over Dazai's head. There's no point in telling the professors, not when they already know about the threat. Dazai tried again with a pointed glance in their direction. Dumbledore brought the stone. Here, so that when Quirrell tries to steal it, they can catch him red-handed. That's what Dazai would do. Snape's insistence that Dazai simply lay low around Quirrell proved it. So, he said, whirling on his feet to face the twins. We're a few steps ahead of Quirrell now. That he's lost his bartering chip with Hagrid. That's the first step in every great prank, knowing something no one else knows. Dazai could see the exact moment that Fred and George's need for chaos won out over. Trepidation. He pounced on that boyish eagerness. Before Quirrell has the chance, Dazai said, we're going to steal the Philosopher's Stone, for ourselves. The twins blinked owlishly. Then, without warning, they grinned at him as wide as could be. Our boss is totally insane, Fred said. He's perfect. George cooed. I can't wait to see the look on Dumbledore's face when he realizes we saved the stone from nasty old Quirrell. Dumbledore wouldn't be getting the stone back, Dazai knew. By the end of the semester, the Philosopher's Stone would be solely in Maury's hands. Dazai felt himself smiling now, regardless. But one thing at a time. Fred and George roped their arms around Dazai's shoulders. We miss dinner. Oh, Dazai said. It was dark out now, and only the lights inside the castle windows acted as a beacon for their destination. So we did. They beamed. Want to learn how to sneak into the kitchen, Snakey? Dazai didn't really have the stomach to eat anything, but with the twins beaming so proudly, he supposed it couldn't hurt. Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.